5 seconds here. Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Daniel Port, and welcome to the Pitcher List Ottonewbs Offseason team recap and draft pre-draft show here. We're looking to kind of get people more familiar with the Ottoneu format that's through fangraphs.com. We love it, and so we wanted to make sure we helped expose it, and we tried it for the first time just this past year, and my God, that we have so much fun with it. I can't wait to dive into everything with you and show you how these leagues work if you aren't familiar with them, or kind of help everyone get better with them or more familiar with them if we're just getting started off like we are. Thanks so much for joining us. To kind of fill you in a few things, pay a few bills, take care of some things before we get started off. Here with Pitcher List, I just wanted to fill you in on a few things that are coming up. For those of you who do not know, on the 16th, just the 16th. So Tuesday the 16th, just a few short days away, we are launching our newest version of our site, 6.0. I know Nick has been hyping it up for a few days now. In fact, a few weeks, if not a few, I feel years almost. He is just so excited for this, and so are we. There's so many things to show you that we're going to bring out. So many things that are very, very exciting that we just honestly cannot wait for you to get your hands on and see and experience. So again, that's next Tuesday. We're going to launch. There's a ton of things going on that day. If you have any questions, reach out to us. You can hit me up at Daniel J. Port or Nick at Pitcher List. Let us know. We can help you with any questions or help get you all excited like we are. Other than that, we're here to talk Ottoneu today. And, the offseason is part of what makes Ottoneu so unique. There's a whole arbitration system and roster cuts and getting ready for a second draft. It's like a whole new take on really how you do dynasty or long-term leagues like this. And, since it can, have unique rules and things like that, I was thinking kind of how could we explain these? How would we go into them? And I thought, who better really to have join us than to talk about the rules and walk us through them and how they were designed and how they're put together than the founder and the man who put it all together himself. So we actually have Niv here on the show, the founder of Ottoneu, here to talk with us. And here he is. Niv, how's it going? Oh, great. Can you hear me, Niv?
Yeah, I got you. Sorry,
okay,
man.
Perfect. Thanks.
Thanks for having me on here. I am really happy to be here.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, of course.
As I was mentioning, we just had a blast with this league this year and really
awesome.
had a ton of fun. It's been a real joy, and it's kind of fun to see the side effects of how many things came through these new unique rules and the ways we approach them. It affected everything from how we thought long term to trades even and everything that's gone down in the offseason. So it's just been a really cool experience as we went through things. So
that's awesome.
Kind of walk us through, if you kind of want to get started, what makes, maybe we talk broad and move in, what makes the offseason in an Ottoneu league so unique?
Yeah, so it's a year-round game. So that's the start, right? You're basically playing fantasy baseball 12 months out of the year. There's stuff to do every month, I think. So that's the beginning. The off season is really interesting because you can build your team for next season. You start with the arbitration, obviously, which is like a sort of the ending of the previous season, in which you get to sort of recalibrate players' salaries who broke out in the previous year, mostly. And that really aligns with how we try to make it so that teams who got really great values in the past don't just keep those great values forever, which is sort of a traditional dynasty problem where you get to keep a player forever at a really cheap price. So if you hit a lottery ticket with somebody, that can be a league-breaking thing for a few years, and Ottoneu tries to balance that out. And then the best part, honestly, people love it. You get to talk about trades in November and December and January. And if you show me another fantasy baseball league where you get to do that with a really engaged group of people, you guys are probably in the middle of it right now, or obviously the keeper deadline is January 31st, so you get to make trades up until that. date. And I mean, what was your first offseason like? Like, did you guys make some trades? You guys do some stuff, take advantage of that stuff?
We absolutely did, and there was some really interesting aspects to it. Between the arbitration, adding players back into the pool we didn't expect, to also generating trades as people tried to, generate either filling holes they didn't know if they could through the draft, or trying to clear up cap space or build for the future, or things like that. There's such a really interesting.
So you can go so many different directions, right? You can decide that I really want to compete this year, or I don't like this value, and this other player, this other person I'm playing with really likes this player at this salary, and like you can just make like a challenge trade like that. You can say like I'm gonna start hoarding prospects and rookies, and hopefully a couple of those guys hit, and then next year I'll be really good. So you really just have this opportunity to build your team in the offseason like any number of ways you want to, some combination of the things I just described. And like that, I don't know, that to me is extremely unique. And it was like one of the big driving forces when we started coming up with Ottoneu. It's just, baseball teams get to make trades. Baseball teams get to engage with their team construction in January and December. And I wanted to also do that. And, that I think is one of the best parts of Ottoneu, is being able to do that stuff in the winter.
No, I totally agree. And, like I said, it was a real good time. And to fill in for those who do not, or may not be as familiar with Ottoneu, I feel like the first driving force to kind of have everyone kind of get is, essentially the cap and roster space, and, that kind of drives everything at some point. You're always cognizant of how many players you have on your team and how much cap space you have. And, that really formulates how you want to, build your team, how you want to go about things, or what your options are. Can you fill us in kind of on how that works?
Yeah, so we have a 40-man rosters, so that's much deeper than a traditional fantasy baseball league, but maybe not as deep as the deepest dynasties. We have a $400 cap, so that's a little bit non-standard again for auction leagues, a little bit deeper. So you have to basically you're allowed to go over those numbers in season by taking on loans, which is like a whole trade dynamic thing you can do during the season. In the off season, though, by January 31st, you have to get to 40 or fewer players and $400 or fewer dollars in obligations before your auction draft, and you can start like building back up over that again. So that puts everyone on real level footing, and but it still allows you to be pretty deep. So 40 roster spots, but you only have 23 position players and pitchers that you have to place every day in your lineups. So you have a lot of room for a deep bench. You have a lot of room for prospects if you want to go that direction. Our player universe is robust, to say the least. We add first-year draft players as soon as they sign with their major league organization. We add players as soon as they're posted from, or as soon as they're signed from international leagues like Korea and Japan. So you have a big player universe to fill those 40 roster spots with. And the 40 spots and $400 are like the core economic system of Ottoneu, that you have to live within those bounds pretty much all year. So it's a good restriction, but it's not too restrictive, I don't think.
Not at all. I mean, it like you said, it's enough that it forces you to make a decision as to how you want to build your team. You can't just kind of willy-nilly do it. But it's not so restrictive that if there's really a way you want to build your team, you can't do it. So I think it's one of those weird things where you think a restrictive, cap like that limits options. And I feel like in so many ways it actually kind of drives and allows more options to flourish in an interesting way. So I love it. Yeah.
And you're playing against, everyone else has those same restrictions. And so there's like a collective cap of the league. Mm-hmm. And that also since everyone has a different way of they want to approach their $400 and their 40 roster spots, it really lets you like execute a strategy that may be different from everyone else in your league or whatever. You get to do some really interesting things, I think, because of the way the dynamic works.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does this really very interesting thing of creating in a way that reflects sort of a lot of real baseball too, where you're creating hopefully assets at all times. Right. So it's like you might pick up a prospect, and you're like, you can think of it as, well, I'm building that to the future, or you can think about it as something that's a trade piece. You know, well, I know a couple guys in our league are prospect heads. That's an example in our league that, you know, that's nice trade value. Later on down the line, you talk about when you're talking about loans and things like that. Like that's such an interesting thing. That, like in the draft, you don't actually have to like leave the draft with all of your money spent. You know, right? So like you can then later turn out and give loans to people or things like that. It's just like you have this way to make everything kind of work. It's really interesting. And actually, we have when we talk about loans, we have one of our commenters, Uncle Flip 87, is asking about. He's thinking about suggesting a loan cap on trades in the league I'm in, and was wondering if we had any advice on that. And I know we'll talk a little bit of strategy towards the end of our cast, but I don't know, Niv, if you have any thoughts on that or anything.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the way the loans work, just to be clear, only in season. You can't make loans during the off season, but once your auction draft is done, up until the trade deadline, which is generally the last day of August, you are able to package money with any outgoing trade. So if you want to trade a very expensive Mike Trout, for example, which is something that I'm going to have to do this season, you can package money with that Mike Trout in order to get a better package in return, so that the other team doesn't have to absorb all the salary. So this allows you to be a little bit more, allows the highest end players to be a little more liquid in terms of assets in the season. If you had to, given the prices that some of the high end players go at, without loans, it'd be impossible to move them. There are some leagues that do loan cap, and there's different ways of doing it. You know, you can just set a hard cap. You can sort of mess around with it and try like different things every season. I generally like I'm in league that has the ID 1, League 1. We do not have loan caps at all. We've never had loan caps. We've been playing since 2005, I think, under this system. Mm-hmm. And we've only had a few times we have had teams that really built huge salaries, like $600, $650 teams. I think we maybe once had a team eclipse $700. But what we have found is sort of like the natural market of the league sort of corrects against that, because when you put all the expensive assets on one player, on one team, I should say, the last person making a trade there is just not getting as good value as they would get if they traded their high expensive player to anyone else. At some point, you only have so many future value assets that you can trade out. And if the same team is just getting every single high priced asset, they're just not giving away as much as the second, third, fourth place teams could be doing. So we try to, it's tough because I don't want, I try to be really hands off with the rules, and we try to make the rules sort of work in a very natural way, so that you don't have to have here's a limit, but then here's another limit, and here's another number I have to remember in my head. So I understand where you're coming from, especially if you have a league where you're still sort of sorting out how to buy and sell trade, buy trade and sell trade players in the middle of the season, where you're like, I'm a buyer, I want every expensive asset, and I'm just going to give you every single piece at the end of my bench. And the second place, third place team don't step up. You can have a problem where you have a $700 team, but over the $400 cap. But generally, your league will eventually learn that using the same team as the team that you want to give your expensive assets to just has diminishing returns. And so I just would recommend against the loan cap, and I would just sort of focus a little bit more on getting better returns from your in-season trades. I think a lot of people don't realize, again, it's trying to match a Major League Baseball dynamic. Both sides of every negotiation have leverage in Ottoneu trades. That's not true in a non-dynasty, in a redraft. If you're in 8th place and you don't really have a path of getting back up to first place, you don't really care about giving away your best players. And then if you're in a deep dynasty, that can be sort of flipped, because there's no real urgency to continue to make your team better. Because we have arbitration and inflation, everybody has sort of an urgency to keep getting better. And the best teams, when they're trying to buy, they don't they're not buying from teams that are just totally don't care, because if those teams are interested in getting like top prospects or like really cheap, good pitching, or, you know, any number of ways of building a winner, they also have leverage against those teams because they have 4 or 5 teams that want that really good asset now. So, yeah, I would just like the trade market is super interesting. We could probably talk about that for like hours.
Right. We could have one thing just about that. And we're going to actually, as we go through the teams, break down some of the trades that we did have go down and things like that when we get down later. But I just wanted to throw in, having gone through it the first year and looking at a lot of the loan caps and Uncle Flip 87 to kind of also throw in what my experience with that was. You know, there's so much of like, and what Niv was saying about how having so many different things like loans or, you know, anything like that. What's really fascinating is this idea of really it forces you in a way that I think sometimes when you play regular fantasy leagues, a lot of times when you propose a trade or you try to negotiate a trade, I know a lot of people don't seem to like look at what the other team like genuinely needs. They tend to look at it from like, what are they willing to give up? And I think loans really give another angle to be like, and same thing with prospects or anything like that, where it's these other assets to say, okay, well, I really want to make this trade and I really like this player. And the guy's like, oh, I need a little bit more than that. You don't necessarily have to give a player to do that. This gives you just another way to be like, oh, but it looks like you're tied up against the cap. But how about another $10 or, you know, whatever.
I can help you on the money side. But then you really have to give me like the top asset that I want back.
Right.
And then the other thing, you know, when you come to it is like the second place, the third place, the fourth place teams are also probably trying to catch there. They probably have really interesting assets too. And so you have just like this interesting market dynamic where you can try to use these different different buyers to really get the best future assets for your team going forward.
Absolutely. And I would say the last piece on that with loan caps is I think that's also on flip is that just look at, you know your league and your league mates often that we know it's one of those funny things that's like the famous saying, you know it when you see it. You know, it's kind of thing that whenever someone's like, oh, should we veto trades or should we, you know, is this collusion? You know it when you see it, you know, kind of thing. And
you know when it's gotten out of control. And if you know that that it's gotten out of control, you can rein it back in with a loan cap.
Right. And you know the difference between that and when you're just like, oh, well, that was a really savvy trade and it ticks me off that I didn't do it.
Right.
You know, that gets into that. I always feel like when people want to veto certain trades, you're like, you're just mad you didn't make that trade. And so that's kind of when you get that feel in that trade-off, that's kind of as you feel that out and talk with some of your league mates and things like that. But that's kind of loan caps. But to move us to the next thing, to talk through the offseason, because like I said, we'll look at some trades later on and talk about that a little further and how those went down. But so next is arbitration, right? So the season ends, you start trading, you start talking, but then we get to arbitration. Now, as I understand it, every player on your team that isn't a minor leaguer gets $2 added to their price automatically, correct?
Right. And then every minor leaguer gets $1 added to their price automatically. Okay. So that's the natural inflation that happens. That's every single league in Ottoneu across the board, basically 2 days after the regular season ends. And then we have an arbitration system, and that's, I think, 100% unique to Ottoneu. I'm not sure anyone else does anything like this. We basically let the 11 other people or 15 other people or however many people in your league other than you just go at it on your team. Just really decimate your team's salaries, right? But you get to do that to everyone else. And the goal is basically you see everyone's full roster listed out, how much they're currently being paid after the inflation was applied, and then how much everyone else in your league wants to add to that salary. And it's sort of a collective knowledge way of adding a couple bucks here and there to undervalued assets or underpriced assets, I should say, to bring them closer to like their either what they're producing or what the market would pay them. And the goal there, again, is just to prevent teams from really running away with amazing assets. Like 2 examples come to mind immediately in Ottoneu's history are Mike Trout and more famously Juan Soto, where Juan Soto, was sort of a mid-tier prospect coming up. A lot of people had him stashed for $2. He came up with the Nationals in 2017. We've been talking about this a bunch recently, where he he was just called up because the Nationals ran out of outfielders, right? He wasn't like this huge hyped debut. And so a lot of people in Ottoneu had him for a couple bucks or just got to auction him right when he debuted. And he had an amazing rookie year. And obviously we've seen what he's turned into. And without arbitration, he would be a $10 player in Ottoneu. And whoever has a $10 Juan Soto is winning every year. And he's still underpriced. Arbitration doesn't correct all the way in one season. So he, in 2021, I believe, is averaging around $55. It's still like a little bit cheaper than Mike Trout goes for, Bryce Harper goes for at new auctions. But it slowly corrects him so that you still have this great asset. You have to pay him a little bit more than just the basic inflation every year. But you don't have to pay him all the way to his market price. And you don't get to run away with the league, but you still have this great piece because you recognize that Juan Soto was good. And so arbitration sort of, again, it's a balance between correcting against someone just running away with the league every year for 5 years straight and totally punishing you or not giving you any value for recognizing like this player, I think this player is going to be good. When you hit something like that, you are rewarded because the arbitration process takes a little time to catch up to that production.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I keep saying this, but like as we're about to move into looking at the different teams and whatnot, I listed in for each team, and we'll see it when I share my screen, all the different who got arbitrated, like basically who got arbitrated. I don't even know if that's a word.
Arbitration dollars.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, who got like increases laid onto them pretty heavy. And it seems like our league also used it a little bit to try and force a player back onto the market,
right?
Or say, okay, well, if we really start tacking onto this stud player, either they'll put him back on the market or it's going to strap his cap, stuff like that too. So there's a lot of different ways you can do that too. And it was a really interesting process to go through to see how everyone who people targeted. And again, you I tried to put it on my memory banks too, because you see they put up a couple guys on this that might be something they value, or something like that. So
when you see
a lot of information too.
Someone throws $1 onto one of your players that you were like, oh, I didn't know that there was that perception out there. And then at the end of arbitration, you get to see who allocated that money and how it was distributed. And then you can say, that immediately starts a trade talk, right? That immediately lets you start engaging with well, you think this person was underpriced. So do you still think that? And do you want to engage on a talk on him or whatever?
Yeah, exactly. So that's arbitration. And then once we get through arbitration, you then get about almost 2 months, right? Or pretty close to that.
2.5. Yeah. So arbitration ends November 15th. So you have basically from just before Thanksgiving until the last day of January to make trades and to cut anybody you want to cut. And cuts, while they're in-season cuts, are have a cap penalty associated with them. In the offseason, there's no cap penalty associated. So you're just free and clear of that money. And you can free yourself of any player that was overpriced or injured or just not interested in playing anymore. And you can make any trades you want to.
Yeah, exactly. And we saw, it was really interesting that because of the way the arbitration inflation worked, that some of the teams who were right on the cap cusp all season suddenly were, $80 over the cap. And so suddenly they had, and this is kind of the thoughts. And as you put it, they had to cut players to get under that cap. And not just get under that cap, but then cut enough that they also still had money for the draft. Because in case I didn't mention this before, that then whatever money you end up with after you make your cuts, out of that 400 that carries over is what you then get to go into the draft with.
Right. So there's a single budget, right? And that's also a little bit different. There's a one budget for your in-season free agents, your draft, your just the whole time you have a $400 budget. That's it. So you have to get yourself to a place where you have $1 free for every roster spot you have free so that you can field the full 40-man roster. And with inflation, arbitration, you are under constant pressure to make sure that you are competing and that you're ready, because you might have to cut some really good assets in the offseason just due to price.
Yeah, absolutely. And, then, and in fact, what was really interesting about that too is then that sparked a lot of trades on our end too. where
Awesome.
there were a bunch of trades with the big trade teams who were like way over the cap, were like, we got to shed some assets, and teams who were under the cap at that point were like, great, perfect, okay, so here, I'll take this.
I'm well positioned now.
You know, right. So really, it's really fascinating in the way that the system as a whole, because it may at first, one of the things I want to emphasize, it may at first seem like this can get either really competitive or really punitive, and it really doesn't. In so many ways, the cap and the cuts and the arbitration end up facilitating in a way that I don't think regular leagues that I've been participating in, it really seems to sort of not force, but it seems to force the issue enough that everyone's kind of like, okay, let's do this, right? We have this and you have this, and let's make it all work in a way that I don't think you see in a lot of leagues. And I had a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, I think we have, like, on a per league basis, like, just a ridiculous number of trades every year. Like, it's a super high number. We were going through, like, we were counting the trades as they were getting accepted on January 31st or whatever. Like, if you like making trades, if you like wheeling and dealing, like, Ottoneu has a ton of systems in place that just encourage trading. And I think you said it perfectly. Like, you may at first think these are punitive systems, but actually they're encouraging you to make really fun deals and to constantly be thinking about where your team is and where everyone else's team is, what they're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to accomplish, right? You mentioned that before. It's not necessarily, what can I get out of you? It's, well, I need to make a deal and you need to make a deal. So let's make a deal. Let's make a fun trade. Let's do it. And Ottoneu has that, like, in spades. It's really fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's like this very interesting other dynamic real quick to cover with that I thought that I noticed in our league that came up was, since there is that huge gap between cuts and, the deadline, is that we saw probably about half the teams, we saw like 3 or 4 teams, my team was one of them, that the moment the beginning of the cuts ended, we kind of knew and figured out, and we just made our cuts, right?
Right.
And then about midway through, we had a couple more. And then like several teams, like basically like 2 hours before the deadline, cut everybody, right? And it made for this really interesting like dynamic of how you choose which players you're gonna cut. Like I cut Josh Bell at one point, who was at a fair price, was fine, but I was also in my head like, I could maybe get him a little cheaper since he had an off season. But then I also was like sweating it until the end because I was like, but what if no one drops first baseman and I don't have anyone in the
only
draft,
one
right?
Josh Bell. Yeah.
Right. And so it created this really interesting dynamic of like how you plan out your cuts and saying to yourself, well, do I think no matter what, I can get myself this position filled through the draft or things like that? It was really just a lot of fun.
That's awesome. Yeah, that is definitely it, man. You nailed it. Like that, when you're thinking about, you don't get to only think about just your team. You get to think about the other 11 teams, what their needs are, and what you're walking into in the draft, because the auction draft is a Wild West, and you better be ready for it. So
right. And so that's kind of how the offseason works. And then, like I said, we ours is in March. We're going to have our draft.
Awesome.
And, for those of you who watched us last year do the draft live, it won't be a 10-hour 2-day extravaganza this time, I don't think. But
I hope not. Yeah, it shouldn't be.
No, I think I aged like 15 years by the end of that. I was so tired. But it was a lot of fun. It was really cool to see one of those in action and whatnot. And like I said, with the cap and the way it's done, it was so cool to see. I really feel like 12 teams went in and they all went in with different strategies and there's like, I think these days we've gotten regular auction drafts just like such a, we figured it out enough that's like, here are the 3 strategies every team should do, and that's about it. And I feel like everyone kind of approached the draft totally differently, and it was really cool to see. So it's just really fun. I'm excited. We'll and I'll remind us at the end, but we're gonna do we'll live draft the draft again.
That's awesome.
So we'll do that again. And maybe we'll have to drag you on and have you guys come tell us everything we're doing wrong in real time.
I'm not the right person for that, man. But yeah.
But,
you can definitely cause a lot of problems in auction drafts, and I am usually the victim of just totally mispricing players. And I try to get as much certainty before the auction draft as possible, because, man, I am a mess in those.
And one thing to bring up before we move on to the team breakdowns real quick here is that one thing that's really great about Ottoneu is I want to give a shout out to the community. It has a really cool community to it outside of just the awesome work that Niv and Justin Vibber and many of the other people there at Ottoneu do. They're a really tight knit community and really seem to be really. I think do you guys have a Slack or is it a Discord?
We have a full Slack, which has I think 650, 700 members in it right now. Not all of them are active, but a really robust, rich Slack that talks about basically everything, but really engaged on Ottoneu stuff. A lot of leagues have their real-time conversations in there so that they can. I'm in a league now where I am co-managing a league with Chad Young, and we have a Slack channel, and I think on the 24th or 25th of January we had winter meetings, and so everyone's just sort of put time aside and just said like, hey, between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. Eastern time, make some time to be on Slack, and everyone just post your trade blocks, and I had a ton of fun. Everyone's DMing each other and trying to sort out like, look, we have this $26 Shohei Ohtani, and we got to figure out what to do with them. So someone help us out. And so we're just talking trade like that. And then we also have a community forums, which is community.ottoneu.com. There's a ton of tools there, a lot of questions for new players that are answered, a bunch of wish list stuff. So when people use the site and they're sort of like, man, I wish this was a little different, I'm always in there, and I'm happy to engage with any of those requests as much as possible. So, and in fact, the arbitration system that we just described came out of a wish list item. It was a community-driven suggestion. So I work really closely with my community. I think it's a great community, tons of knowledgeable fantasy baseball people, and a ton of people that have gone on to work in Major League Baseball clubs and stuff. So just a top-notch group. And it's really tight-knit, really supportive. And if you're feeling a little intimidated about Ottoneu at any time, the community is there to answer questions and loves just having new people to play with because they just want new people to make trades with, basically. So
yeah, right. Well, and that was one of the reasons I brought it up was just that if you do feel a little intimidated by that, by all of this and the process, it's been my experience so far, both in being in a league and kind of checking out the Slack for a little bit, that everyone is really supportive. It's not as intimidating. I think sometimes fantasy baseball can get a little aggressive sometimes when you're new. And Ottoneu definitely did not give me that. The community did not give me that impression. So that was really cool. And then you also have the surplus calculator tool out there as well, which is really useful and can help kind of make all this a little less overwhelming as well sometimes.
I know I'm not exactly the person to talk about it, but because Justin does all that work and it's super great tool. And I think he might be coming on a little later. I'm not 100% sure. But
that's a rumor.
I will make a pitch that the surplus calculator is the easiest baseline way of figuring out what is going on with your team. And that's I think the toughest part is not understanding the rules or understanding all the systems. It's just figuring out how to evaluate players and how to value players. And having a baseline of the surplus calculator, which uses projections and looks at all the rosters in your league to sort of create a market and figure out who you have as free agents and how much people pay for expensive players and for cheap players and everything like that. And really just tells you well, here's a starting point for what we think this player is worth on your roster, and here's what you're paying him. And if you do that, it just really gets you in a mindset where you can start really grokking how Ottoneu works. I think it's a pretty intimidating and then not at all intimidating system is what I think Ottoneu is. It sounds really intimidating, and then you get into it, and then you're like, oh, this isn't as bad as I thought. And there's a lot of tools that help, and there are a lot of people that'll answer questions. So I highly recommend trying it out.
Definitely. I totally agree. I couldn't recommend it more. Like I said, for year one, we've had a real blast, and we're looking forward to year two.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Thank you for putting it all together and for doing this and for coming on here. This is great.
Yeah, of course.
So I think from here, kind of as we've explained the off season, hopefully that makes sense. The rules are also, by the way, on the site really easily to kind of figure out and work your way through. If you have any questions as we're going through the draft, as we go through the show, please, in the comments or anything like that, please feel free to ask anything. We'll try to answer them as best as we can. At this point, given that once if he's ready, I was going to bring on our commissioner, actually, Mark McElroy, and have him kind of walk through some of the teams with us. And maybe if you want to hang out with us, Niv, you're more than welcome to, or anytime you need to kind of head out or anything like that, obviously you do what you want to, but
Okay.
we're just so happy to have you here and have joined us for this part. I know you're kind of more on the development side of things as well.
I play in a couple leagues, but I think my understanding, the rumor is you're going to have some real heavy hitter experts coming on soon. So I will get out of your way.
Okay, sounds great.
Thanks for having me, though. I really appreciate
so much.
It. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk maybe a little bit more coming into the draft and maybe see if we can have you on again and talk to you then.
Absolutely. Happy to do it.
Thanks so much, Niv. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of the day. And oh, by the way, I don't think I mentioned this before, but don't you have an anniversary to announce, by the way?
Oh yeah, so I guess tomorrow is Valentine's Day, of course, and it's also the 10-year anniversary of Ottoneu. We launched on Valentine's Day 2011. My at Ottoneu Twitter shared the original Fangraphs blog post, which if you told me 20 years ago that I'd get to write on Fangraphs and be friends with all those guys and get to come on and talk to Nick and all the people I've talked to through Pitchers and stuff, like, just mind blowing to me. It's crazy, but yeah, we've been doing Ottoneu for 10 years, and yeah, it's awesome. It's
so cool,
really fun, and we have leagues that have been around the whole time. So that's the best thing I can say about it. There are leagues that are going strong that were founded in 2011 and have no signs of shutting down. So if you're looking at a game that you want to have some friends and you want to play with them for a really long time, we made a lot of connections, a lot of friendships through this, and it's super fun. So try it out. 10 years tomorrow. Crazy.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much again, Niv. I'm going to bring Mark on and enjoy the rest of the cast and the rest of your evening, sir. All right. So now I brought him our glorious commissioner here. Make sure I kiss up as much as I can while he's on here. Mark McElroy, who writes with us for Pitcher List. He does a ton of different things. He wears a lot of different hats. Correct me if I'm wrong. You are also taking over for the newsletter this year, correct?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you great.
Okay,
Sound
perfect.
Fantastic.
I am the newsletter manager. And so I'm going to be responsible for getting the newsletter out every day of the week and twice weekly, which is a little confusing, but we're doing a lot of newsletters this year. And just to highlight all the things that we're doing, when Nick hired so many new people in the fall, they just started pounding out all this incredible work, and the newsletter is going to be a chance to highlight it.
Absolutely. And it'll be much better than the poor sucker who used to run it.
It's not true. That's not true.
So Mark and I used to work together on the newsletter. So that's where we first got to know each other. And so last year, Mark comes to us and says, I've been wanting to try this thing out for a while. And, I figured this is the only place I could find 12 people who are crazy enough to do it. Would anyone be interested? And he says this thing called Ottoneu, and I'm like, oh my God, I've wanted to do this for so long. Yes, please. I just don't have 12 friends who will put up for me that long. And so when Mark suggested this, it was fun because we had decided we all were going to kind of go in cold turkey and kind of figure this all out together. And it was just a really fun league. It was a really good time. Before we jump into the teams and looking at all that stuff, Mark, how was the season for you both as commissioner and, obviously as being in the league and whatnot?
It was great. I couldn't imagine a better group of people. I had a couple of stipulations. Everybody had to be completely new to Ottoneu. They can't be an expert. They can't have gone through everything before. This is the first time doing it. So I wanted us to all kind of be on the same level. I wanted us to all learn through this process together and help each other learn, right? When I learned something, I passed it on to everybody else in the league. And when they learned something, they did the same. So it was a process of learning the game and all the intricacies and the rules and how to play it and the strategy and all those kind of things together. And then once we learned something and figured it out, that's when we'd write an article and pass it on to our viewers and our readers. So it was really just an idea factory, really. And the league itself was, we had a lot of people making mistakes, but we had a lot of people learning at the same time, including me. I mean, I'm doing things and reading things about Ottoneu, and then hoping that they worked. And it doesn't mean that it was the right thing to do, but it was an attempt, right? So
Yeah,
you and I made a couple of trades and had no idea if they were good things to do or not. So it was one of those learning processes, trial by error, and that's what the whole league was. So we're definitely not experts, and we didn't profess to be, but we were learning as we went and using each other to build information and knowledge and share that knowledge. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And you did a great job as commissioner, and we had a lot of fun. And with that, I thought, and we'll see if a few other folks want to join us and come talk about their teams or talk about the experience as well. But we thought we'd kind of dive into the teams and take a look at kind of how our teams and seasons, off seasons went, because I think it kind of represents, interestingly, when I was talking with Niv just a few moments ago about how diverse all the teams end up being and how everyone's kind of doing different things in a way that you don't normally see in fantasy leagues. I thought it would be really a good learning tool to go through those teams and see what it seems like everyone's doing, and then also kind of see if there's some archetypes we kind of see, and also just see if there's how we go about it, what's kind of going on. So I thought I would bring up some of those, and so to kind of give you an idea, I'm going to bring that up. I'm going to share my screen here real quick. If everyone will just give me 2 seconds here. And first, I thought I'd show, just to kind of see how everyone feels about this. Okay, share screen. I love you, StreamYard. You make things so easy. Okay, so as you can see here on the screen here, hopefully that's big enough for everybody. Oh, yeah, perfect. Thank you, Justin, for sharing out, or the Vibot for sharing out. I assume that's Justin, for sharing out the homepage for us. But here you can kind of see here's all the different teams. And what you can kind of see is this is just post cuts. So we haven't been able to obviously do anything since we made all the cuts. But you can see, first looking at all the players, you've got some teams that are as high as 32 players. So they only have like 8 roster spots to fill as they go into the draft. And you see some as low as 15. So everyone's kind of going in from different spaces and different things that they want to accomplish coming into the draft. And then you can actually see how much salary cap we've all kind of used up, and then how much everyone's got left, right? So you see some places are going in, and we'll kind of dive into these because they're really fascinating. Some only need to get 8 players, but $169 to spend on those 8 players. And, some that need to get 10 players and only have $16 to spend on that, or somewhere in between all of those. So it's a really interesting way to look at the different teams and kind of see what they're looking to get and maybe how they go about getting those things. And I kind of think of it in a funny way, that from here, it feels like I'll be interested to see how it goes in the draft, but it feels like you have to have a plan. So that's kind of the very interesting strategy of there's just one overall, one size fits all sort of way to look at this. But so that's kind of where we sit as far as, it looks, and you kind of even see in here, if you scroll down, who needs like what positions, who doesn't have catchers or things like that. This is kind of a very fascinating little overview here. Some teams went really heavy into, pitchers. We got a couple teams with like multiple double-digit starting pitchers already. We've got some that don't even have, my team doesn't. I'm the Parma Pierogies, in case anyone's curious. Shout out to Cleveland. I like it. Yeah, YOLO. I think that's how I went through the draft. Uncle Flip 87 was YOLO, and it did not go as well for me as I would have liked. But nonetheless, I think that you can kind of see how we're all starting to construct our teams, and it's always interesting. Like, how do these teams like 4 third basemen go when there's only one spot for it? Stuff like that. So to kind of dive through the teams, though, what I did was I took and looked at each team. I kind of made this semi-fancy Google Doc here of each team. And what I looked at was what players did they receive arbitration raises on and how much, and what players did they end up cutting, and then kind of looking at, and it's my own projection, this isn't anything to do with the players themselves or the managers themselves, kind of what their starting lineup would look like if the season started today, right? So, I thought we would, and obviously I'd love to get Mark's insights, kind of some of the things that he sees, having gone through the process once already, but to kind of say, if we see any sort of patterns, if we see anything we would do if we were them, those kind of things. So, and then hopefully if we do it wrong, they'll yell at us in the comments or hop on to yell at us. But so the first team I thought we'd start with was our champion, who was one of our writers, Zach Dobroff. I think I said that right, Dobroff. Team bang the can slowly. And, he was pretty much the front runner for most of the season, if I remember correctly, right, Mark?
I'll take issue with that.
I know you were winning for a large while, right?
Yeah, I was leading for a long time, and then Zach just kind of slowly caught up and then passed me, and just continued to maintain the lead for the rest of the season. So I had a really good start to the season. I was leading for much of the first 3-4 weeks, and then around that point, Zach just passed me and then continued to go. And I made a bunch of trades to try to catch up at that point, but it wasn't enough. So Zach comfortably won. He had a 10.5 point lead at the end of the season, I believe. So
here I can actually pull up the final standings here if you want to see them, folks. This would be, here, I'll go back to the main page here. You can actually see where our league ended up. Standings wise, I believe should be, oh no, that's my team. Hang on, sorry. Yeah, so you can see, so yeah, by about 10.5 points there. And Mark, obviously you finished in second, which is awesome for our first time through. Someone down here was quite a ways down. But to look at back at what Zach did in the offseason, kind of give you an idea of how these things go. So he got a couple arbitration raises here and you can see here it's some young players who he obviously picked up. And one of the things he did very well throughout the season was pick up young players or players that were a bit overlooked as we were going through the season. So he gets Dylan Moore. He picked up this first dollar amount here is what he got them at, right? And then what they ended up at after the arbitration increases. And so he gets like Dylan Moore for $2. He gets Randy Arozarena for $4, Framber Valdez for $3, Jay Cronenworth for $5. And you can see that we saw that in the offseason as a collective league and said, we can't let you carry that value into the next season, right? So that's one way you see arbitration used a lot, as Niv was saying, right? Is that you can't, sometimes we see that value and say, well, we don't want you. We want you, if you're going to keep that valuable player, you're going to have to pay for him now. So is that kind of what you experienced as well, Mark? Did you lay any of these arbitrations on Zach's team?
Oh, I believe I did. It's amazing though, if you look at the results from our auction and the players that ended up getting hit on Zach's team, Moore, Arozarena, Valdez, Cronenworth. I didn't get time to check the others, but they were all pickups in season. He didn't draft those players. He picked them up in season. And those are the players that were very valuable. He got them for almost nothing in season auction. And I believe Cronenworth was one of the people I nominated because I wanted him. But Zach did a really good job in season using his budget to grab these players. And it shows in the fact that they were arbitrated. They received arbitration dollars at the end of the year. So I was looking for players on other teams that were really inexpensive and players that I thought that the other managers would keep.
Right.
I didn't want to allocate money to players who I thought would be drops because I wanted that manager to get stuck with that money and that salary for next year and hopefully even 2 or 3 years down the road. So a player like Randy Arozarena was really easy because the arbitration happened shortly after the World Series, so everybody had a Rosarena in their mind and his performance during the playoffs, and so he was a really simple, easy target, especially when he was only at $4.
Right.
So it was easy to ding him. Again, surprises like Dylan Moore and Jake Cronenworth. These are people that I expected that Zach would keep in the coming year.
Well, I think it does end up doing something too, where
I'm actually
now there's
VR.
Sorry.
I'm actually surprised to see VR on this list of arbitration raises, because he went up $5, and you can see that he ended up being dropped. So,
and that's an interesting trade-off that we'll kind of mention as we go through the teams, is that you'll see some of these players who you wonder if some people dropped some money on them to see if we could get them to, to get them back in the pool, right? And you kind of see some of the effect, I think, of throwing those extra dollars onto some of those cheaper players, because you get the difference between Jay Cronenworth at $5 versus $9, or as you said, Arizarena at $4 to $13. $9 increase only means he probably can't keep Nolan Arenado anymore. So that guy ends up back on the block, right? So that's always a really interesting. I wonder if that's how some people sort of looked at it as well.
Yeah, well, we'll see when we get to my team. My team was a nightmare, but I don't know if that's the best use of the arbitration money to stick it to VR.
It's interesting
because he said he seems to be such an easy cut at $23. Maybe not in a 5x5 league where stolen bases are so valuable, but I think we gave VR too much as a group.
And it's interesting if you look over on the right here, where I've got kind of the base projection, just kind of looking at who I would start probably if I had this roster. And he's got a lot of it's a deep team, and obviously JP Crawford at shortstop is probably what stands out to me the most. And if you go back to how much available cap he had here, you're looking at, let's see here, and we'll look at free agents towards the end when we talk about like overall strategy going into the draft. But now you see Zach has about $68 left, right? So is he going to be able to really find a good replacement for JP Crawford there? That's an interesting one for me. And looking at his outfield, I like that outfield, but I could see maybe trying to get another outfielder. Looking down at his pitching, I like his pitching a whole lot. I think it's pretty good value for pitching, but maybe you want to pick up one there. So that's kind of where I see his team at. It's in a good spot, but he's got about 12 players he's got to pick up or so, and only about $60-something to go with it. So it'll be really interesting to see if he comes out of the draft then with a shortstop, or if he has to go try and trade for one or something along those lines.
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting because he can do it either way. I mean, he could go into the auction and try to find a value shortstop or a value outfielder.
Right.
Or he could look for a need that somebody else has and try to find a value there and then make a trade.
Exactly.
That's a possibility for him. When he has to fill $68. He has to fill 18 roster spots.
Yeah.
$65 or let's see. What's his team name? Okay. Bang the can.
Yeah.
Okay. $68. That's only $5.70 per spot. So
right.
You're not really going to get a huge shortstop with $5 per player. And let's say he gets a few $1 players. I mean, what's he going to get for $11? Right.
So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of Zach's team, and it's a really interesting thing. Is again, Zach won, and as we said, he ended up winning with a lot of in-season management. Mark, to go to your team, since you were our second place team, you dominated the draft. If memory serves, it was you and Mary who ended up finishing in third. Both of you absolutely crushed the draft. You did a really great job of knowing when to pick your spots, and then kind of just capitalized when all of us ran out of money.
Well, that's what we did. We did well in the draft because we didn't spend any money for 4 hours. We went through the first 3-4 hours of the draft just twiddling our thumbs and watching all these players go at $50 and $60. I think so many of us in the league thought, well, I have $400. Let's just go crazy. And so they started bidding like madmen, and they just had so much salary tied up in so few players that once they realized it, that they didn't have enough money to get through the rest of the draft, that's when Mary and I just started picking players off one by one. And that's how I got Lourdes Gurriel for $13 and Kenta Maeda for $7 and AJ Pollock for $4. Like I had a lot of players that I was targeting late that some of them did well and some of them didn't, but I got them for cheap. And once I got them cheap and had lots of surplus in those players, I was able to trade that surplus for value and production in season. So my team is very, very different than it was at the after the draft, because I traded so many players. I traded and traded and traded, and it didn't end up helping me. But at that point, I was in second place and I was gunning for a championship, and so I was looking to transfer my surplus into production, and my team ended up, I had to cut, I believe I had $622 of salary that I had to get under 400. So it was a lot of cutting before the deadline. So my team got here. My team got dinged a lot in arbitration, but I added a couple of columns here. I dropped quite a few of those players that were arbitrated, that had arbitration dollars allocated. I dropped Dahl, I dropped Correa, I dropped Donaldson, I traded LeMahieu. So that's that's $17 of arbitration dollars that didn't impact my team, or it's no longer a part of my team. So I had to cut. You can see my list of cuts. $51 Scherzer, a $42 JD, a $43 Bueller, a $39 Rendon. And Rendon is one of the players I bought in the draft, but that was a panic buy in the draft. I was watching everybody take all the players I wanted for $10 and $12 more than my preparation sheet had. And I panicked. I thought, well, I got to get some players. I have to go for something. So I ended up buying Rendon, which wasn't a bad buy. He had a good season, but I felt he was overvalued. And so I dropped him back because I have a sneaking suspicion that because managers spent so much in the first year draft, that they were going to drop a lot of players, because I felt that we didn't have a lot of surplus on our teams and that we had overspent. And so I think I thought people would drop a lot of players, expensive ones. And I think that they will go for a lot less money than they did before. I think I can probably get some of these players back for less salary than they have currently. So that's my hope. And then I hear about people talking about inflation, and I start to worry that maybe that's not going to happen. So I'm worried that my $27 Matt Olson, who I really like, is going to go for $32 instead of what I am hoping will happen. It goes to 18. I don't know what the second year draft is going to look like, and I'm a little bit worried that my idea and hope that these prices will go down will be the complete opposite. So it's interesting to see the pain at which I had to drop all these players, and I had to trade LeMahieu and Castillo, because that was $66 worth of salary. I really had to dump so much, and a lot of these cuts were not because I didn't like the player or didn't want to keep them. It's that I couldn't afford to keep them. So I got rid of so many players, and I'm hoping to get a lot of them back, but we'll see if that happens.
Well, and to talk real quick, because this is a perfect time to talk about, even though my team's way down the line a little bit, because, again, I did not do as well as I wanted to, and I'll talk about that later. But this trade that you see here, DJ LeMahieu and Luis Castillo for Shane Bieber, that was actually a trade you and I made each other. And, this is a perfect example of kind of what I was talking about with Niv about the way the trading system works. Was this is exactly what ended up happening was Mark was looking to shed some salary. And I had ended the season only like $20 or $30 over that 400 cap because I was using a lot of $1 players and things like that throughout the year. That I suddenly had this big surplus of cap space. And so I said, cool, let's try. And basically what we did was Mark consolidated those two players into one. So he was getting good value back. And since I had cut a lot of $1 players, I was looking to do the opposite, to use good value. I was willing to trade probably the number 1 or number 2 pitcher in baseball at good value for 2 players because I had the cap space to pull that in and take a slight downgrade at pitcher to fill some other spots I needed to fill. So that's kind of how, in case you're wondering how some of these trades can go down, it can go down and everyone kind of benefits, right? I don't think we look at that trade and be like, oh, well, one person got screwed in that trade. I think we really kind of worked that out well.
Well, it was one of those. It's one of those things that makes this league so much fun is that we're all friendly and we're in this for the right reasons. So we're here to have fun and to learn this game. And I had the mindset of this being very honest with everybody in the league. I basically said to myself, I'm not going to fool anybody here. We're all smart people. We know that we're not going to get any fast ones pulled. So I'm going to be very straightforward and honest. I'm going to tell everybody that these are the players that I'm looking to move. And if you want them before I dump them, you better come and talk to me because you might not want to get to have Luis Castillo in the auction draft or DJ LeMahieu. So you better come talk to me privately and we can work out a trade so that you won't have to deal with those auction dynamics on these players. So you reached out to me because you were interested in LeMahieu.
Right.
And everybody in the league wanted LeMahieu. They love his multi-positional eligibility. He was a $21 player last year. He's got arbitrated up to $29, but everybody still wanted him. I think it was a player like that, having the multi-positions is really helpful in an auction because if there's value for a second baseman, you can move DJ to third. If there's value on a first baseman, you can move him to second. That gives you so many options in the auction that I think people were really excited about that.
And that's exactly why I went after him, to be fair. It was why I wanted him, was that exact thought process. I'm like, this guy gives me so much versatility going into the draft that I can do exactly that. I knew I had either a hole at second or a hole at first. And so it was like, I don't have to overspend to make sure that the hole's filled. That if I'm waiting and I find a good value at second, cool, I just move DJ over to first. If I manage to snag a first baseman for good value, I move him over to second. It's perfect. So that was kind of my exact thought process.
Yeah, and what I did is I just looked at your team in the surplus calculator, and I found that I looked at who was a value according to projections, and Bieber was an option, and I thought, there's no way Daniel's going to get rid of Bieber. He's a Cleveland player, and you love Cleveland. And, and I was not expecting you to trade him, but I thought, you know what, I should try to get Bieber, and the only way I could do that was if I included a pitcher. I figured you didn't want to downgrade your pitching staff so much. I thought, well, maybe if I give you Castillo, pair him with LeMahieu, that A, helps me with my salary problem, and B, gives you 2 solid players, including a pitching replacement for Bieber. And then you were like, yeah, I like that trade. And I thought, I started thinking to myself, what am I missing here? I thought, am I doing something wrong here? Because I like this trade and you like that trade.
Right.
And we both were like, well, let's just do it.
Yeah, and it's such a funny thing that's like the the big change, you know, because I always have those same butterflies whenever I make a trade of being like, what am I not seeing? It's like chess where you make a move and you're like,
Yeah.
I'm probably not seeing how that just checkmated me. I don't understand.
Yeah, exactly.
And like, you know, that I didn't feel like I felt that at first, but then like we talked through it after we agreed to the trade, and we're just kind of like, oh yeah, you know, just kind of thinking our way through of what we were looking for. And like, you know, my like based on my thought process was I'm trying to fill 2 roster spots. That's one less player I have to, and yeah, I paid a little more to do that. But now I know those 2 things were set. I didn't have to chase them in the auction draft.
Mhm.
You know, especially knowing that there was going to be a lot of money out there that I didn't want. You know, one thing we found in our first draft was that there was a lot of price enforcing or price running up, and so I just wanted to avoid that hassle. I was just like, let's just get these guys, fills 2 spots I really need to fill, gives me a lot of versatility, and so it was a really nice trade. It was a really pleasant experience.
Yeah, and I think that's a part of the Ottoneu, the way the whole thing is set up. I knew I was in trouble with salary, and so I had to handle that somehow. And when somebody has money to spend and somebody has money that they have to get rid of, it just sets it up for gives you options for trading. And
absolutely,
it worked. I think it worked out pretty well for us.
I agree.
I don't know what the other people
think that's a bad trade, but
yeah,
we liked it.
I thought it was fine. I'm excited to see what your next guests have to say about it, because I'm happy with the trade, and
me too.
It gets me underneath where I need to be for for the auction. I dropped from $622. I now have $174 available. So
you know, yeah,
that's a lot of roster positions I have to fill. I have to fill more than anybody else on the team in the league, but we'll see how that goes.
We got a lot of money to do it with, so
I gave myself some money.
Yeah. And so then we got Mary's team to move to our next team here, our 3rd place winner, Mary, who also, as we said, really killed the draft. She did a great job. Waited till we all kind of ran out of money and then capitalized. She saw, you know, sort of, and I mentioned this when I was talking to Niv, that we can be a bit prospect heads. There's like pitcher list guys also too, that like, and Mary had a bunch of them, so she kind of got hit with the arbitration hammer for like Will Smith. You got to be like, okay, we got to enforce that price a little more. Same with Brandon Lau. Like, you can't let those be deals. But then, like, you know, a pitcherless guy, everyone loves, like Nick Senzel, for instance. And so he got some dollars and some things like that. And, you know, she ended up sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's Will Smith, the catcher.
Yes, that is the catcher
from 4 to 13. So yeah, that was pretty safe to give him more salary, because one of the best catchers in the game right now, certainly one of the best hitters. Yeah. So there, we knew that she wasn't going to drop him. So we probably could have added another $5 onto that, and she still would have kept him.
Yeah. And we come over here and look at, obviously she cut a ton of players, had to kind of move a few pieces around to get under the cap, and she's got herself a good, healthy amount of cap space. If we look back over here to Mary, she's got around $100 to get about 19 players. And
yeah, it looks like she really focused on cutting overpriced players.
Which is
she cut Blackman. $30 isn't bad. Certainly at the start of the season, it wasn't a bad price, but no, I guess she got him for 28, but in the draft, but you can probably get him for less than that, or at least the hope is that you can get him for less than that. And she did the same with Wilson Contreras. She didn't need the second catcher, at least a second catcher for 22. Right. So she kept Miyadi for 4 and Will Smith for 13 and got rid of her $22 Contreras. I mean, if that salary for Contreras had been a little lower, I think she would have been able to trade him in the offseason. But at $22, she's not going to get too much back.
Right.
So probably better for her to put him back in the player pool, either get somebody, and then what she could probably do in the auction is bid him up if she wants to.
Yeah, absolutely.
But also, if she wants to get a good backup catcher back, she might be able to save some of that $22. So I think that was probably a wise cut. Again, she had two players, Puig and Tanaka. Puig, we're not sure if he's going to play. With Tanaka, we know he's not going to play. So that was an easy cut. I traded her Puig in the season because I was hoping that I got him for a really good deal in the draft. I traded him to her for Noma Mazzara, who I love, who just hasn't been performing. And then Mazzara's salary went up from $6 to $8, and I decided I can't keep him for $8.
Right.
This guy didn't do anything last year. He's not a young prospect. I mean, he's still young, but he's not a prospect. So we kind of know who he is. We were hoping for a breakout, but will it ever come? So I cut him. And it's funny that she cut Puig at the same. She cut Puig as well. So that trade just ended up being a nothing trade. Nothing ended up happening for either of us on that one. But that was tied in part to the fact that every major league player gets an increase in salary, just a basic end of season increase in salary. And then at that point, it's just too much money. So it makes sense that she cut him.
And looking at her team, she's got a really nice offense. Obviously outfield, when we look at the free agents, you'll see this. There are quite a bit of outfielders out there. So I think if she had to try and improve her offense in one spot, outfield's kind of a good place to do it. Not have to worry about it. It will be interesting to see is what she does if she tries to do anything with that cap space she's got left to improve her pitching staff. She's got a little space for improvement down in here. That might be where I'd expect her to kind of move towards finding an improvement. That way, I could really see that being where she focuses. But otherwise, I like her team. I think she's got some really nice young pieces that are good. I think she's got some nice controlled pieces, there, and her infield is just stacked. You go Brandon Lau, Trey Turner, Javi Baez, Manny Machado. It's a really nice building block for your team in there in your infield. So that's where I would expect to see her go, is to see if maybe you can't do better for an ace with Jose Barrios. Because I can see easily you go and spend big on an ace, right? Let's say, right? You'll get one of the big aces that are out there. I know Garrett Cole's out there in this league.
Bueller.
A couple other, Bueller's out there.
I dropped Bueller, so he's available.
Yeah. You go and get one of those guys, and sure, it might take up a big chunk of what you've got left. But after that, you're really not filling too many starter roles anyway. So you can then get a little creative. So I could see that being the route she goes a little bit there as well.
I haven't delved too much into the free agent pool right now, but I know that it's not like there's one outfielder that's a really top quality outfielder. There are 7 or 8. So if we'll get to David Fenko's team, but when David Fenko stretches all his money out in the auction and gets a whole bunch of stud players, there'll still be players for Mary to pick up that aren't going to cost an arm and a leg, right?
For sure.
She doesn't have to spend the $60 on the one outfielder. She can wait and let somebody else spend that money, and then she can, like she did last year, is she can wait around and then get some value late in the middle part of the draft.
Exactly. And so then to move to our next team, the Lollygaggers. So Dylan, when he when you look at kind of where his arbitration went, it's something similar in that, what's really interesting to me, and you'll see this with a few teams later on, prospects got hit pretty good. And then if you had a stud pitcher who just broke out, like Lucas Giolito, obviously getting a whole $9 tacked onto his price, that really that was sort of where you saw a lot of arbitration money go to as well. Same with Nelson Lamet. And, his cuts seem pretty straightforward. They make a lot of sense. I don't really see a player out there I'm like, oh, I'm surprised he got cut, other than really seeing Chris Bryant get cut in there. But then you come over to where he's at, and it's really interesting to see his team, because if you look at, let's see, Dylan's got $65 and needs 18 players, right? So if we look over to where he's at and who he cut to where he's going to have to kind of fill in some gaps here. Like I said, I kind of tried to fill in, obviously, Brendan Rodgers might not play start with the year of the season, but he's the only shortstop he's got. So that was kind of where, he's going to be hunting for a shortstop somewhere in there. You're going to have to get a third baseman, and third base is pretty deep. When we see the free agents, you'll see there's quite a couple good options out there. And he's a bit top heavy. So he's got Trout, Soto, and Meadows. That's what, almost just off the top of my head, probably $150, almost $160 just in 3 outfield spots. So it'll be really interesting to see how he balances that out. But then to go to the other side of it, is pitching staff is stacked, right? I love his pitching staff. Going Snell, Giolito, Fried, Lamet, and Hendricks. Like that's a very, very good pitching staff. It's going to be kind of tough to keep up with unless the rest of us are willing to spend to keep up with him. So he's got definitely a nice solid base in there. So it'll be interesting to see where he goes.
Yeah, he didn't cut a lot of big price tag players. He has a good chunk of salary tied up in the players that he's got. And so he's not going to do too much. I'm not going to need too much in the draft. He's not going to have a lot of money to spend in the draft either. So he's going to be quiet for the first little bit and try to look for some values late. But he's got so much already, and it'll be interesting to see if he's going to make some moves in season. How did he finish last year?
He was our fourth place team.
He was fourth.
Yep.
Okay. Right. So of course he was fourth. So he has to decide pretty early on, maybe first couple of months, if he's in it or not. I'll have to see how the draft goes and go from there. But he's going to be in a really good position to if he wants to trade a guy like Trout. He'll be hard pressed to decide whether he wants to trade Soto, depending on what he can get back. He definitely has some options to move some of his pitchers if he wants to. And he can send some of the money away to the other team and get some really strong prospects or some values back. So he's in a good spot, even though he has a lot of high-priced players.
Yeah, and I can see with this bench down here, as I was going to highlight this. So you see he's got Ian Anderson, Lance McCullers, Nick Pivetta, and Kyle Wright down here. My first thought was, it's 16, 21, 24. Yes, I have to add it up as I go. I'm not that mathematically inclined. So he's got, first it's like, oh man, it's, $24 in just on your bench in pitching. Is that necessary? And then it is a daily league, so you can swap obviously pitchers out. So it's a good way to stack the categories like wins and Ks and things like that. But on top of it, this gives him either the flexibility to move one of these players. You get like a Lance McCullers, who's kind of a pitcher list favorite, that kind of thing, or easy enough to swap one of them in if you want to be like, man, I needed that piece. I didn't get it in the draft. You've got a lot of firepower up here to go get a big name if you need it without losing too much because you've got this depth. So it's an interesting way to approach that, I think, from that perspective. So that's a really I like the way that's kind of going, and I'm interested to see how it goes in the draft. Yeah,
I'm curious as well. I don't know what he's going to do with Trout and Soto. At $63, that's going to be $65 next year.
Right.
Just without any kind of allocation to that salary. It's going to be interesting to see what he does with Trout, because if Trout's not stealing in a 5x5 league, then he might not get that value for Trout, or might have to decide that he's just too expensive. And maybe that's not true. Maybe people say, well, $80 Trout is something you do, but at $65, he's going to be put to a decision, especially if we sting him with some more money at the end of the year.
Right, for sure. And that's, like we said, it's sometimes you can tack on some money to try and get a guy like Trout back out on the market there.
Yeah.
So then we move on to our, I believe, our fifth place team, the Dizzy Llamas, who are managed by Adam Howe. I think it's Howe, right? Let me know if I said that wrong.
Yep.
So he's one who got a bunch of money tacked on to essentially his pitching, really. Yes. He had a lot of young pitchers that he got absolutely right. So he gets Zach Allen for $22, Jesus Luzardo for $18, Corbin Burns for $2, and Trevor Bauer for $19. And, we saw all that and said, no. If you're going to have to come back out with that next year, you're going to have to pay some money for it. And so he got a lot of money tacked on to his pitching staff. I guess it's the price you pay for getting it right.
Yeah.
And he's another one. He cut, as you can see here, cut a lot of players. To give you an idea of his situation cap wise, to find his team, Dizzy Llama. So he's got about 24 players. He's got to get about $89 to do it. So not a ton of money to do that. Might end up being somebody who has to kind of come back and figure that out with some trades and stuff to clear some space, maybe post draft, especially when you see if you come over to his team here, you know, he's got $62 tied up in Acuna, 47. This is another one that's pretty top heavy in a lot of ways. 47 in Story, 28 in Torres, 26 in Abreu. I wouldn't be shocked to see him have to, and then you throw in those numbers I said for his pitching staff. I wouldn't be shocked if we end up seeing him post draft having to move some of that. You know, maybe that's what he chose to do, was to say, I'm going to choose to hold on to these assets because they are assets, and we'll see what they end up being or what I need post draft. But you know, he's going to be relying on a lot of getting a lot of things right again, I think, next year.
Yeah, he's going to have to. He has. Let's see. He has 16 players and he has $89. So
yeah,
that's a $3.70 a player. So he's going to go total stars and scrubs. He's just going to go into the auction looking to grab $3 and $5 players, a few $1 players. He might be able to get something bigger, but he's got his stars already.
Right.
He's
and that's
just
the
going
thing, yeah.
He's just going to go in looking for value. Now, I just want to point out something that you see here in his cuts. He had to cut Wander Franco for $20.
Yes, good point. Yeah,
obviously he didn't want to do that. He loves Franco. He drafted him, but he did. He was one of the people, and everybody did this who bought prospects in the draft. Is we overpaid for prospects as a group. Joe Adell for 12. These are overpaid. $9 for Whitley. Like, we spent too much on prospects, and that's one of the things that I learned in this whole process is prospects are really good to have on your team because they're good trade bait, but they're not good if they're not playing, and B, they cost too much money. So
well, it's worth. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So we didn't. We just spent. We thought, oh well, this is a dynasty league. We need to have dynasty players, so we need to think about 2 and 3 years down the road. But the fact is, in an Ottoneu, it doesn't take 4 years to rebuild. It takes 1.5 to 2 years to really have to go from last place back into first place. So when you have $20 Wander Franco. Yes, he might end up being a $20 player, but he's not all that valuable to us in this league because he just costs too much money.
Well, and I do think it's worth noting too. One of the things that, and I know that we have a couple prospect heads in this league, and Adam is one of them. He loves those prospects, and you can kind of go down the list and you can see a bunch of them even in there. Aside from those two, with Dylan Cease or going down even like a Logan Allen or a Bryce Wilson, But what I would say is the thing I think I learned when I started thinking hard about the arbitration, and what I would say, especially if you're going to your first year drafts, think about this, is that where Mark is absolutely right about, if you're getting a guy who's saying like single A, right, or something like that, by the time he comes up, say it takes him 3 years to come up, just on its own, just from time going by, he's going to get $6 added onto his. $3 added onto his price. So it'll be $4 by the time he's already up. Let alone anything else we put on that player in arbitration.
That's right.
So that's something you always have to kind of, and we'll talk about that. You'll see this when we get to Dave Sherman's team because he's done a really nice job of this. But it's one of those sort of things where you start saying, yeah, okay, but by the time he's ready to contend, does he then? The things he thinks are bargains now, do they become too overpriced? That's something to always keep in mind when you're doing prospects in the draft, is to say, you don't say, cool, I got blah, blah, blah at $3. You say, okay, am I happy with that guy at $6 to $10 by the time he's ready to come up? Right. That's right. So that's something to kind of think about.
If Wander Franco had been a $6 player, I think you would have kept him. But at $6, we would have dinged him with arbitration dollars, so it wouldn't have been $6. It would have been probably $12,
right,
or $14. And then at that point, does Adam want to keep him even at $14 for the whole upcoming year. And yes, he's getting close, and he might be playing this year, but he plays for the Rays, so we don't know what they're going to do. They might just keep him down for the whole season. We just don't know, and it puts the other managers to a tough decision, and that's something that we always want to do when we're playing in fantasy, is make the other managers have to make a tough choice. And
right,
I don't think dropping him for $20 was a tough choice, even though he may love him.
Right. That's why I actually didn't. I was contemplating throwing arbitration dollars on him, and I was just like, no, there's no way he's going to keep him for $20 anyway. So, so then we look at our next team, with Knuckle Curve. That's Colin Charles's team. Sorry, I have to look this way because my screens don't stack correctly sometimes. So here we see with an interesting mix of not even middle level players, but he got stacked up with certain breakout players like Pablo Lopez or Randall Grichuk, got price enforced, and then a couple prospects did. Vlad Guerrero kept getting added to. Now I'll give this, basically everyone in our league is big Vlad heads, so I think that was part of it, was people trying to see if he'd end up back out on the market. You see Marcelo Zuna, who's a bargain at that price, so we bumped him up a bit. Lance Lynn got bumped up, Freddie Freeman. So you can see this was one where we looked and said, no, we want to keep making sure that if we bump up the higher end players, it felt like we might force him to jettison some other pieces by making those sort of a bit heavy. And you actually see he ended up having to throw back several, really big name players like Patrick Corbin, Marcus Semien, Max Muncy, Ketel Marte, Giancarlo Stanton, Garrett Cole, Christian Yelich. We really kind of, by making those a little more punitive, it definitely, I think, forced his hand a little bit to have to force a lot of those players back into the fold. So it'll be really interesting to see where those players go in the draft and kind of his approach from there. And to give you an idea, so we can see his overview here, Knuckle Curve is, why can't I read? So he's one of our players who's got a ton of available cap space. He's going to be one of the guys who can really dictate what's going to go on in the draft room a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see what he does, because that 246, in fact, that's the second most in the league. And he's got 18 players to get, so it's not like he can go too crazy. But I wouldn't be shocked if he's thinking, I have enough cap space, I could probably come back and get Yelich again if I want, or get Garrett Cole again if I want.
So I think he had very much the same idea I had, where he dropped players that he thought were overpriced and that he can get them for a discount in the auction.
Exactly.
I think he wanted to drop those players and give himself enough money to have the hammer on a lot of them. And so he put them back, knowing that I think he probably plans to bid on Christian Yelich. But if it goes up to $60, I don't think he's going to be interested. But if he's at $50, then I could see him Yelich back on Colin's team, for instance.
Absolutely.
I think he had the same mindset I had, and he does he have the hammer? No, he's close to the hammer. So he's in a good spot. I think that he and Dave Sherman are going to be battling a lot in the auction with all that money they've got sitting in front of them. And I think these two are going into the auction with a plan. They know what they want. They know what they need for their teams. They have over $10, over $11 a player that they can spend. And I think they will. I think there's going to be a lot of fireworks between those two, a lot of price enforcing by the rest of us, and a lot of us just sitting around watching them and battle it out. So it's going to be interesting. That's for sure. I find it interesting. He got dinged with $53 of arbitration.
Yeah.
I'm not sure exactly why he got hit so hard, because he finished in sixth place. I guess we all just like his team.
And he just had a lot of clear discounts, right? I think some of it was, like I said, I think some people were trying to make sure that Freddie Freeman, maybe we tried to get it so that was a punitive sort of thing to make him get rid of some of the other players that he had. But then also, like, I feel, a lot of it was some price enforcing. Like Lance Lynn gets a whole $8 tacked on to him, Jesse Winker got 7, Max Muncy got 3, Marcel Ozuna got 6. So I think he ended up getting hit with a high total just because we saw he got a lot of bargains. And we didn't want him to be able to just kind of fill in his team from there.
Yeah, he had a really good draft. He had a lot of players who really had great seasons, surprisingly great seasons. And I think he had a lot of players who were on good salaries. I mean, Ozuna at 19, well, he bought him for 17. Freeman he bought him for 33. Lance Lynn for 14. He obviously either caught some of us napping at the auction table, or they were late enough in the auction that we just didn't have the money to get them, because there are a lot of good prices there. And Cabrian Hayes probably should have been hit a little more than $3, but that's fine.
Well, there's some interesting questions that were asked of, like, for the record, when we did this draft, it was well before we knew it was only a 60-game season. And, the changes that came with that. So, like, I wouldn't be shocked if one of the reasons got Marcell Ozuna so cheap is because we didn't know there was going to be an NLDH at that point. So there were a lot of questions about his playing time, things like that. So, it's one of those funny things to keep in mind is that, like, now we know differently. And so we reinforced it, that kind of thing. So, that's kind of the joy of the arbitration system there.
Yeah.
Now,
just before we go on, I'm not sure if you mentioned it. You probably did, but I find it really interesting what he did with his pitching staff. Instead of keeping any of expensive pitchers, he dumped them all and kept a lot of low-priced pitchers, which is the complete opposite to what Adam did. Or is it lollygaggers? Dylan. What Dylan did, he kept all his expensive pitchers and dumped all his reasonably priced ones. Lower priced ones, but he's definitely happy with his higher priced players, whereas Colin is happy with his lower price players. So he's going to be dipping into those really expensive players, the Walker Buehlers and the Garrett Coles and stuff in the auction. So it's going to be fun. Yeah,
no, it's a great point. He's created himself a nice floor there that, like, if he ends up only getting like 2 stud pitchers, any one of those 5 might be a really nice bargain there, right? So that's a really interesting, if you're looking for like a draft strategy of when you decide how you're going to keep players, this is one way to go about it. Be like, cool, I've got a nice floor. I've got some good guys who are all kind of number 3, number 4s with potential, or solid kind of, guys who you can kind of depend on. Now he's got the room to go chase those things, because worst case scenario, if he doesn't get them, he's not like dependent on that,
Yeah, and he's not going to need to look for any relief pitchers, because he's got Iglesias, he's got Pagan, Soria, Castillo, Helsley, and Hicks. Like, these are all players who either have the closer job or are going to be in competition for it. And at the first week of the season, the team might announce that Jordan Hicks is the closer, and then he's got another $3 closer. So he's not even going to probably look at the auction table when a relief pitcher is on the board, because he just doesn't need them. So that's a powerful position for him to be in. He doesn't have to spend any money there. He can focus on the things that he does, replacing his outfielders, and he might even be in for a high-priced catcher as well. So
yeah, you never know.
We'll see.
And so then we get into, and again, it is important to note too, folks, when as we've mentioned, and it's just something to always keep in mind, you do not have to spend all of your money in the auction too. As we've mentioned, there are loans, there's, a lot of times you can take on, we talked earlier with mine and Mark's trade about how when you have some cap space, it allows you to make some moves and absorb some. So he doesn't have to necessarily spend all 246 of that in the, he can fill in as he wants with, good values, and then just basically be able to throughout the season make almost any trade he wants to, half the time. So he's got a lot of different ways he can go with that kind of space. So then we get into our 7th place team, Donnie's team, with Donnie. I always screws up. Moskowitz. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It's weird when you really only interact over Discord with some folks, since we're spread out all over the country. I'm sometimes like, that's the first time I've had to say that name out loud, even though I talk to that guy like every day, kind of thing. So But so looking at where Donnie's team went, he had a decent wider range, but he had no real big price players had to go. And for the most part, he doesn't really have any big price players really weighing his team down. Jose Ramirez at 37 is a perfectly reasonable price for him. It's interesting to see keeping Yordan Alvarez 30. That could either be that's either going to be a great deal or a bad one. I totally get not wanting to put him back out there.
I think if he gets word that Alvarez isn't 100%, I think he might consider dropping him. If he comes out flat at the start of the season, if he has again more problems with I believe it's his knees.
It is his knees, yeah.
I suspect he might throw that $30 back and get 15 back. So that's an option, but he's got such a good salary on Springer, and he does have a great salary on Ramirez. Ramirez is like, I spent most of the offseason trying to get Ramirez from him, but it just didn't happen. I love him, and especially at that price. That's why I dinged him so much in arbitration. So, or did I? Oh my goodness, he didn't get dinged at all.
I don't think so. No.
Oh, well, he should have been.
And Donnie's got a lot of cap space to work with still here. He's got $143 in here to get about 19 players. So he's sitting in a very pretty position in which he's got no big contracts weighing him down, a lot of cap space to work with. And, if you look at his team, he's got some holes to fill, but, it's at the, shortstop, which is obviously the deepest position in fantasy for the most part. Util can be anybody he gets a good value for. Same for the middle infield, that's another one that's, again, you've got shortstop. So it's very deep positions that he's got to fill. So he may not even have to spend all that much. And so he may be another guy who can sit down and say, cool, I've got rule of the kingdom for the entire season. With the kind of cap space he's got left.
Well, and one thing he's got too, you see Keston Hiura as his second baseman. We know that Hiura is going to be moving to first, so he's going to be in a position where he has Voit and Hiura who can play first. He can either move one of them for a deal or one of the things he needs, or he can just swap them in and out of the lineup based on handedness and matchups and stuff. So he's in a good spot there.
And I like his, coming down to his pitching staff, he's got a good basis for it. Obviously, right now, Devi Garcia and Luis Patino, because since they technically don't qualify, they won't qualify until they get sent down to the minors to be minor leaguers in the league yet, because they did pitch last year, are slotted in there. But there's, that's not who he's going to go into the season with starting there. But to have Yu Darvish and Woodruff both on really manageable contracts is not that bad. Right, it's one of those things. That's a nice basis, and again, with the amount of cap space he has, he can really go after some of those big name pitchers like a Garrett Cole. So he's another one we could see maybe going up and really ratcheting up the price on some of those. We might see like a Garrett Cole $80 bidding war. You never know.
I hope so.
Yeah, that'd be fun.
Yeah.
So I like Donnie's team, and I like where he's kind of sitting. Like I said, he's sitting nice and pretty, nothing strapping him down too much. This could be a really solid team for a couple of years based on what he's got here.
I really like Donnie's draft. He did an excellent job drafting, and I kept looking at his team he was the one team I looked to every time. I looked at his team first because I knew he had so many players that I liked. He had such a good draft, and so some of them were really reasonably priced. He and I made some trades in season. I gave him Darvish for some insane reason. I traded him, but I love Darvish, and I wish that he was still on my team. But I traded him Yastrzemski too. I drafted Yastrzemski for $1, and I traded him. I traded him for value. I traded him for, I don't know who I got back from Donnie in that trade, but that was one of the reasons why I was able to make some moves in season. Was I got some good players cheap, and Donnie has the benefit of some of that. But his team is great. I love it, and I think if he had a little bit better luck in season with some injuries and some opt-outs and things, I think he would have been a contender for the top spot, but it just didn't quite break right for him for things beyond his control as a manager. So yeah.
So to move on to a
your
some bums team, so I'm the perfect example of the other way. So I do have a couple. Just to jump straight to my team real quick here, and then because it kind of gives us context. If you look over here, I I have a couple big contracts weighing me down here. And some of them, like Devers, I kept simply because at the time I got kind of stuck at the deadline where no real big name third basemen have been dropped. And so I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to risk it. And then like 7 of them dropped at like midnight.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, now it's too late. Yeah.
I waited until the very last minute because I wanted to see if there were players that I wanted that were going to be dropped. But B, I didn't want to pass that information on to other managers. So
right.
I'm sure that when I dropped Rendon, he was of interest to you, even though he was a $39 salary. When I dropped him, I mean, knowing that he was in the pool might have led you to drop Devers.
It absolutely might have. And seeing kind of, Eugenio Suarez got thrown back, a lot of those guys. So that would have definitely changed how I approach that. So that kind of gives you an idea of like also when you drop players, your strategy for that. I kept Lindor 55 for much the same reason. 55 is not outrageous. It's worth noting he was going like the 5th or 6th pick in most drafts when we did this draft, right? So and I got I think, obviously. So I think I got him at that time. Then I would have been at 53. And retrospect, obviously, I think that is hampering my team down a little bit. But again, I didn't see enough shortstops go out there that I was like, I feel comfortable messing around with it. And so I kept the superstar. So that was kind of my thought process there, and it's one way to kind of go about it.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to point out those 2 big contracts for context, right?
And another thing is, let's say in May, at the end of May, you're in 3rd place. Well, then you can make some moves to go for it. But if you decide that you're in 8th place and there's no chance you can catch up, well, Francisco Lindor might look pretty good to another manager who's going for it, and you can get a boatload of value and prospects or whatever you want for that $55 because you can send that $55 with him so that to cover his salary, and then you're set up for next season.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
You've got options.
And 1,000. So like one of the funny things that happened with me was to give you a little insight into my thought process going the draft is I was going to go stars and scrubs. And one of the fun things that part of that was because I knew I was doing this 10-hour draft that I knew that it was going to be impossible really to do the auction in a lot of ways and talk constantly about the draft, even with Dave Sherman helped me out during the draft casts when we were doing that, when we did that as a co-hosts.
Yeah.
But so I kind of was like, I want to get into a place where I've got a lot of my bases right away, and then I can kind of focus on talking about everyone else's stuff, and then I can kind of jump in where I need to. Yeah. And so I spent a lot of money up front real fast. It was kind of part of my thought process. But then my idea was, and this is to give you an idea of a team building sort of, both a team building thought process and then where I kind of went wrong with it, was I said to myself, cool. So when I left the draft, was getting towards the end of the draft, I knew I had a couple holes in like the outfield at the end of my outfield and at second base. And so I said to myself, well, what I'm going to do is get 3 $2 to $3 second basemen, right? And a couple $2 to $3 outfielders, and hope one of them hits. Or if I really paying on to it, I got a couple guys who are like platoon players that would have fit, like a Jordan Luplow I picked up because I'm like, he mashes lefties. So if I pay attention, I know because I'm an Indians fan, pay attention to when Luplow's playing and know I can put him in. And what ended up happening was, as I mentioned I was mentioning to Niv, I then got accepted in the graduate school and was not able to keep up with it on a day-to-day basis because it was really hard, in case no one knows this. But so there was a couple things that worked, but then I ended up nailing a few of those picks. So like I didn't even need to do it, which was Ian Happ was a big hit for me. As you can see, I got paid for $10 on Ian Happ and arbitration increases. And same for Kyle Lewis. I got 5. And so like there was a couple of these things where it's like I didn't get quite dinged heavily like across the board, but I had a couple players everyone's like, no, we have to price enforce those. And same for even Shane Bieber getting $7 tacked onto it because that was a really good a nice steal there. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up throwing a lot of players back. A couple of these I had in here. Some of these are players who I looked and said, well, we were talking about, I want to try and get that guy back for less money, And I made a second trade here. I don't have Dave here to talk with about it, but I ended up trading Rafael Montero, who I believe he might be still going into the season as Seattle's closer.
Yeah.
Ian Happ, Kyle Lewis, and Royce Lewis for obviously the big get of that trade, Eloy Jimenez to bolster my outfield. Then I'm a big John Means fan. Anyone's followed me for any time knows I'm obsessed with John Means. So I was really happy to get him. And then a couple prospects. I ended up dropping Jonathan Scope? Yeah, Jonathan Scope. Yeah, in that trade, right after the trade. But primarily it was just to make to make our salaries meet up a little bit. It was kind of more of a
that's you're not. I don't think you're going to go wrong with John Means at $3.
Right.
Especially with Eloy at 28. I don't know how that stands up in the auction calculator, but part of fantasy is getting players you like and want to watch. Especially if you are in school and you have precious time that for other things like watching baseball. You want to have it mean something, and you want to watch the players that you love. So I can totally see why you kept Francisco Lindor, because if he's your favorite player and you want to watch him play, then you might as well have him on your team. Frankly,
I like the lineup he's going to. I like him being in that Mets lineup. Could be pretty fun with him. And it was one of those things that obviously this deadline came right after the Indians did trade him. And that broke my heart enough. I'm like, I'm not doing it to you too, Frankie. I'm not going to do it to you too.
Yeah. I think Dave did a good job at offseason gathering surplus. That was obviously his goal was to get cheap players, guys like Montero for $4 who might end up getting, if he gets 30 saves for Seattle, I don't think that's impossible. I mean, Seattle, if he does, he's going to be worth a whole lot more than $4. A guy like Ian Happ is the strong piece for the Cubs in the outfield. So he made big improvements this past year, getting rid of a lot of his swing and miss. So players like that, Dave was all over trying to get rid of his more expensive players for surplus. And I think it shows in his team and how much money he has left. I just want to point out, I don't know how you and Dave actually did it in being in the auction and Twitch streaming it the entire time. So you two were definitely at a disadvantage having to talk about all our teams while we're all sitting at our computers, pecking away and looking up spreadsheets and stuff and doing some research that we couldn't do ahead of time. We were able to do it during the draft, and you and Dave were stuck commentating and things. So it was a tough position. I know there were quite a few times when you were not upset, but you were like, oh man, I missed that player. What was I doing? I wasn't paying attention. I missed it. And players that you wanted kind of slipped away in the draft because of it. So I just want to thank you guys for doing that. It was really incredible. And I think your strategy would be very different had you not had to do that. So I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. It was a lot of fun. It was a good time. So then, and just kind of look at my team here. Obviously, I don't, again, expect to start Bobby Dahlbeck at first base, although he actually had a pretty good season, hit 250 with 8 home runs. That's, it could translate over pretty well. So, I held on to him, and that was sort of a lot of this was knowing that my foundation here, and it's I think a pretty good one, is, DJ LeMahieu, Francisco Lindor, Devers, Eloy, and Nelson Cruz for my hitting. And knowing that that's pretty solid, and I can fill in with guys I love a David Fletcher who can play so many different positions. So that gives me flexibility because he play every infield position except first base and the outfield. So it's if I see a good middle infield value, I can move him to the outfield. Same with Bobby Dahlbeck is kind of just gives me at least some. If I don't end up getting Josh Bell or another first baseman back, then he might be serviceable. But then he's also a prospect, so maybe the prospect heads might like him. So it's kind of what I was thinking there. Yeah. But DJ, again, as we talked about, gives me that flexibility that I can put him pretty much anywhere that I didn't get.
Well, and you're going to be with $4.30 per player averaging. You're going to have to either hit in the middle of the drafts, the $11, $12 players, or just go for those players that you think are going to break out, the $1 Mike Yastrzemskis and stuff.
Right.
To the point where Bobby Dahlbeck becomes your backup and Corey Dickerson doesn't really play, but he's a nice person to have on the bench, right? You can do that in the draft and you'll be able to get some deals, but you might have to wait a while to really realize that. But
yeah, and I might try to, like, I was thinking about this, not to give away. I'm sure if my league mates are watching, I don't really care. I'll give it to think of those guys like trying to invest in like an Ian Happ or Kyle Lewis, where it's like, cool, can I bet on those guys breaking out? If they don't, it's $1. Who cares?
Right.
But then also saying, maybe trying to get a little young, invest in some young players, like, some prospects, and try and get some trade capital in case I'd want to fill a gap in once we've gotten into the season, especially now with my my pitching staff being real solid. I like Luis Castillo, Clayton Kershaw, and Zach Wheeler's a really good 1, 2, 3. Mm-hmm. Then see if Tristan McKenzie blows up and John Means keeps continuing to improve. It's like that could be a really good group of 5. I think in the draft I'll probably want to go, maybe get 1 or 2 more high upside starters. See if I can't get a little depth.
Another thing you can do, I don't know if this is recommended by others, but you've got 5 RP spots to go. You can decide whether or not you want to spend up to get the saves guys. You might not want to do that. You might want to find a Trevor May or a non-save guy who might step into the role, or at least be a ratio helper who doesn't get saves. Right? You could get a Devin Williams type for cheap. Devin Williams was obviously not drafted, but there's going to be another one of those relief pitchers who steps up this year. And if you get him for $1, he can be a huge help to you. So you can decide whether or not you want to spend up for speculative saves, or you can just go for the ratios, because that might be a chance for you to save some money and get some good results.
Yeah, exactly. So I got a couple ways to go. We'll see if I pull it off, but that's kind of my thought process so far. Mm-hmm. So we go to Dave Fenko's team here, and Dave actually took over for a manager who left the league in the offseason. So that's a really unique sort of thing he had to deal with. And I think for a lot of it, he looked at certain players and said, I'm just going to kind of get me as much space so I can build my team, of thing, and kind of go from there. So you see a lot of big names: Pete Alonso, Aaron Judge, Cody Bellinger, Eugenio Suarez, Corey Kluber. I mean, obviously Kluber was not a big thing last year, but and Mike Clevenger getting dropped. So and obviously some of those make sense. Clevenger just is going to have Tommy John. They're not going to even play this year.
He's not going to go for 34.
Yeah. Alonso, Judge, and Bellinger all had down years. Same with Suarez. So it's not a shock he dropped those guys, but he definitely also seems to be looking at it from his perspective. He's got a ton of depth. If you see how I've laid this out, a ton of depth. And he ends up with what? Let's see here. I'm looking for info F Wars right here. He's got $169 to just 8 players, and that's what's going to be. I'm going to be really fascinated. You talked about this as to whether or not he's just going to go all in and get just 8 big players, really spend, or is he going to say get those 8 players and then sort of save some cash for the season? What's he going to do there? He's got a lot of power without a lot to have to get. It's different where it's like Knuckle Curve, who has a ton of cap space, but still has to get 18 players, or, me. Yeah. Or me, I'm in the same boat that we, that's kind of an interesting balance to see if he just decides to hoard some of that cap space. Or if he's going to spend big, he could do either way. With that.
His average available money for each roster spot is $21.10. So he's a good. The next closest player is $13.70. So he has a huge advantage over the number of roster spots he needs to fill and the amount of money that he has. So I wouldn't be surprised if he spends up big for 1 or 2 players that he really loves. And I wouldn't also be surprised if he just waits it out and He knows that he has more cash than anybody else. Maybe not more actual cash, but he has more cash per player than everybody else. So I wouldn't be surprised if he just looks for value at around that $21 mark. Because if he bids $21 for every player, he's going to absolutely demolish everybody else in the draft, because we're not going to really have the option to spend more than $21 for very sparingly, right? We're each going to probably go for a big star, but he's going to be able to wait and just say, okay, I'll bet $21.10 for each player that I want, and knowing that the other people won't be able to act. So it's really interesting that he dumped all those big players. Now, I don't know if that's because this is a team that he didn't draft and he doesn't like these players, or doesn't think that they're players that he wants on his team, or if he just thinks they're too expensive. He did keep a whole bunch of players, but they're all on reasonable salaries. His most expensive kept player is $30. And he dropped four players more than $30. So he had the option. He had the money. He could have kept some of those more higher priced players, but he chose not to. So I'm interested to see what his strategy is going forward, to see if see what he does, because this is something that I, as a manager, I'm going to learn from. Watching what he's done with his team, especially taking over a team, is something that I'm going to pay close attention to, because I want to learn about taking over a team. And if this kind of strategy works, do I replicate this kind of plan where you keep all those single digit players and then dump the big stars? Or if you go the opposite route and keep the big stars and dump all the cheaper players. So it'll be interesting to see what happens here.
Absolutely. So we've just got a couple teams left here real quick. We'll try and knock these out pretty quick so we can move on to the next step.
Yeah, sure.
Here. So we're into Archie's team here, kind of going through, you got the typical sort of like young player arbitration rates, raises. Just real quickly, a couple surprises I had for this. I'm surprised he kept, see him keep, for instance, Gavin Lux at $17 when we don't even know. I don't think, depending on what happens to Justin Turner, if he even has a job next year yet, is kind of like in that Wander Franco sort of thing. He's up a little quicker than that, but obviously, in a league like this, you see some of the things of like the benefit of having a guy like Otani. If he does come back and pitch, that's a huge value, right? To be able to kill two roster spots essentially with one big spend. It's an interesting sort of build.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he did everything, if he met the keeper deadline.
Oh,
to
interesting.
To be perfectly honest, I think that he's got he has 30 players on his roster, so that's fine. He did make some drops, but he only has $1.60 to spend on each one of those players, one of those roster spots. So I wonder if I'd be interested to hear if maybe he did want to drop a player like Shohei Ohtani at $40,
right?
Or drop a Gavin Lux at $17. I'm not sure. I haven't talked to him about it. I don't know what his thought process was on this. So maybe I'm completely out of line, but I wonder if maybe there were some drops that he intended to make but didn't get to, or missed the deadline, because he does have a lot of players and a lot of very expensive players. So, but it'll be interesting to see what happens. I mean, he could very easily be keeping these players because he wants to trade them. You might want to keep a $17 Gavin Lux because he comes up and knocks the cover off the ball and ends up becoming a great trade target. So, who am I to say what's right or wrong here? I think when you've got a $37 Fernando Tatis, you're off to a pretty good start. So he's in a good spot, and that's a player that we probably every single one of us probably dinged him with arbitration, because he was raised up $12. Obviously, he got the minimum from everybody. some of us probably could have gone the full $3 on Tatis, but no, it's an interesting build and an interesting lineup, and I'm not sure if it was. I don't know if it was completely planned or not, but I'm very, very curious to see if it was planned and if it ends up coming to fruition, because it's very different from most of the other managers in the league. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, for sure. So then to move on to one of the more, because we got just two teams left here, and then we've got a real special kind of treat for everybody here. So real quick, to kind of look at one of the more interesting teams here, this is Dave Sherman's team taking the Hobbits Loizaga. Just real quick, the kind of thing I wanted to note was obviously he got dinged for a ton of arbitration spread out amongst a ton of players. So it's not like he had anyone that got really pushed high just across the board. It's because he's got so many young players. And I think what is going to be interesting to see is either, because he is, I believe, number 2. Well, he's up there, but he's not like the guy for he's got $109 to spend to get 10 players. So he can make some noise in the draft. But the thing is, when I really think about this, is that I wonder if he's what we talked about with Niv with the arbitration style, that like he's got so many young players, and that's really cool. But by the time they're all ready to kind of gel together, unless he makes a big move or two to really bolster this roster as they go, are they all going to be too expensive then by the time they're finally ready to put it all to, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think Dave knows exactly what he's doing here. Yeah, I think he's going to, I think he's got these young players for a reason. He made a lot of trades in season. He decided that he was out of it and he would get rid of his expensive production and get young prospects for the cheap. So he gathered as many as he possibly could, which he did. He doesn't. I think that some of these players he will end up trading for bigger pieces later. I think he's going to be a buyer in season, especially if he's in the top 5 at around June 1st. I think he's just going to go for it. I would expect him to get rid of Torkelson and Hancock and Austin Martin. Like these are players that might not be on Dave's winning team, but they might be on somebody else's after he's already won a few seasons before. So I think he's stockpiling assets to trade, and he's got enough money that he can basically do what he wants in the auction. And he's going to come up against a few other managers, but he's in a spot that he's made a plan and he's going to execute it. So what he's done is really interesting because he's not going willy-nilly. He's just deciding what he's going to do. Created a plan and he's doing it. So I'm very curious to see what the next stage is.
Totally, I agree. And it'll be interesting to see. We'll keep track of kind of where he goes and what he does in the draft as well. We'll talk about that a lot during the live draft here.
Yeah.
To go to our last team here, just quickly before we move on to the next big topic subject here. We've got then the anti-Dave Sherman coalition, who is Mikey Ajetto, one of our very popular writers. You can see, obviously, he's another one who cut practically everybody from his team. You see not a lot over here yet. I believe he has, to give you an idea, he's the leader with $278 in available cap space and needs to get, 25 some odd players. So, he's going to be in the driver's seat. We've talked about it. He's going to be the guy who's enforcing all the prices. He's going to be able to get kind of whoever he wants. And it'll be really interesting to see how he goes about that. If he just goes wild, he was kind of the big price enforcer during the first draft. Yeah. So not too much necessarily to talk about, but it'll be really interesting to see what he does with this
not
team.
A lot to talk about, but I'll blather on for a while. I think Mikey is I think he loves auctions. I think he loves bidding on players. I think he loves trading. He wants to be in a position where he can do that he has a lot of salary. I think he's going to be in trouble in that he's going to be facing David Fenko's $21 per player.
Right.
But I think these two are going to battle it out with Dave Sherman for a lot of players in the draft auction. And if I know Mikey, based on last year's draft, I think he's going to end up paying a lot for a lot of players because he loves to bid.
Yep. Yeah, right. So that's kind of, and so going through these teams, I hope it was kind of informative to see just how many different ways you can go about building teams in Ottoneu and what's really fun about that. And that's kind of, almost all of us seem to have a different way of doing things. That's kind of cool to see each person has a different plan, a different way to go about that. And to talk, actually, to segue into that, to talk a little bit more about that, I have two other guests to bring on to join me and Mark. Mark, you're more than welcome to hang out with us if you'd like.
Sure.
But to talk a little more broad strategy and a little more about how you go and prepare a second round, a second year draft, and then to also look at, some of the free agents that are available and things like that. I actually have two more guests here. I have Chad Young and Justin Vibber from Ottoneu and working over there as well. Let me add them on in. Chad and Justin, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey guys, thanks for having us.
Hey guys.
Thanks for joining us and coming on out. Kind of tell us, just to get things started before we jump into the topic, sort of your Ottoneu experience, how you guys kind of got into it, and all of that good stuff, and then we'll jump right into our topics and kind of go from there.
I'll let you go first, Chad.
Okay, sounds good. My Ottoneu experience is long-standing, we'll say. So I know you talked to Niv earlier today. Niv and I have been friends since high school. Daniel, I heard you mention you're a Cleveland fan. Niv and I are from the Cleveland area. Niv went to high school in the Cleveland area. I grew up there. We bonded over Indians baseball in the 90s. And when we were, I don't know how much of the backstory he told you, but when Niv and I were just sort of, I think, just out of college, early 2000s-ish, didn't really like the fantasy baseball stuff that was out there, decided to design a league along with another buddy of ours from high school, designed a league, realized, hey, this format is super cool and other people would probably like it. And Niv was like, I'm going to build it. And so that's my history with Ottoneu. The original Ottoneu league, the group of us have been playing that. We've been playing in it for more than 15, but less than 20 years. I don't remember the exact number. It's something like that, somewhere in that range. So I've been doing that for a long time. I'm now in a handful of other leagues. I write for Pitcher List, and so you can see some stuff I do there. I also write mostly about Ottoneu at Rotographs over on Fangraphs. So I write a lot of content there about Ottoneu strategy and how things work. And that's sort of my Ottoneu spiel.
That's awesome. Where in Cleveland are you originally from?
East Side suburb. So I grew up in Lyndhurst and then lived in Pepper Pike for a while.
Oh, okay. So I grew up in like right on East Scarborough, so right on University Heights, and then Chesterland. And I went to like West Yaga High School and stuff like that.
Okay. Yeah, I went to Hawkins, so our high schools were right next to each other practically.
There you go. Yeah. All right. Very cool. So that small world, who knew? That's awesome. So Justin, how about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I got started playing Ottoneu. It wasn't the first season, as Niv mentioned, the 10th anniversary here coming up tomorrow. I didn't join the first season, but I did start playing in the second season. So I've been playing for 9 years now. Started with 1 or 2 leagues, and then very quickly that became, as I like to tell my wife, it's like per plebin leagues. It's not a definable number. I don't want to tell you exactly how many, but between us 4, it's been like 12, 13 leagues at times. So definitely became something that I dove deep into. And, the community was a big part of that, getting involved. I was writing at Rotographs for a while as well about Ottoneu stuff. And you guys were talking about Fenko taking over this team. And that's exactly how I started accumulating as many teams as I had, as I loved picking up an abandoned team and having a reclamation project and seeing if I could turn them around and rebuild. I mean, that's what really got me getting the ball rolling to getting to as many teams as I had there at the peak. I've backed off just a little bit from there, but I think I still have 10 teams. So it's
just a little bit.
Just a little bit. I mean, it's a 12-step program to try to just get back to a manageable number.
Well, and remind me, Justin, the auction calculator, which I'm going to show here in the screen because we're actually going to use the free agent list here. But
Yep.
that's your brainchild, right? That's your baby, right? Every year.
Yep. I created that, and I've told the story before, but it basically was something that I was using myself, and I was doing that because I wanted to see how good everybody's keepers were in my leagues and how my team compared to everybody else's keepers. And I was preparing the tool just for my own personal use. And then when we started getting involved in the community, I was doing a podcast with a couple guys that really started that community, that Slack community. And I was like, oh, okay, let's release the tool to everybody. And maybe somebody else will be interested in seeing the same thing. I mean, I've always been a spreadsheet nerd, and I want to see the math, and I want to play around with stuff. And right away there was good feedback. And then from there, I just improved it. Back then you had to paste in your own rosters and paste in, a bunch of stuff. And now it's just, you enter that league number and it pulls everything automatically. So, it took a while to get to that point, but yeah, it was something, and it's taken off now. And, it's good because, as Niv mentioned, the nice thing is that for someone who's just starting out in Ottoneu, I hope at least that the surplus calculator dollar values that are there by default provide a baseline to help that learning curve, so that you at least have an anchoring point to say, okay, well, this is at least the range of price I should expect for this type of player, whether I agree or not with these projections and these dollar values loaded, at least as a baseline. And I think that was another side effect of releasing it, was to have that that tool be available to people that were brand new to the format, or to some of these, the linear weights points formats that you don't find those in a lot of other places. I mean, you guys are in a 5x5 league. You're familiar with the scoring. You know how a 5x5 league works, but how does that work in the context of 40 roster spots and $400, right? Like, that's what you have to learn and sort of feel out the dynamics of how much are certain players worth, given the fact that I have to free up cap to bid on other players by cutting them, and I have cap penalties and things like that. All those things that make Ottoneu unique. It takes some time to learn how the pricing should work, and how do I value Mike Trout versus George Springer, or a shortstop position and everything else. So I think that's the nice thing about having the surplus calculators. At least provides that baseline. And the downside is that a lot of people use it, and so then you see a lot of groupthink sometimes. I get feedback all the time. Well, I hate this thing because now everybody in my leagues is saying, well, he's only $12 on the surplus calculator, so I'm not interested in him. And it's like, no, you're not really supposed to take these things as gospel. It should be, it's just a baseline, and everybody else has to adjust from there. But that's kind of the quick history. I'll ramble for a while if I'm allowed to. So
yeah, one thing, Justin, I noticed is I just assume everyone's looking at the surplus calculator, so I'm not going to be able to pull any fast ones on people.
Right.
There's no sense in trying to steal a $1 Mike Yastrzemski from somebody, because they know he's a value.
Yeah.
They know that he's surplus, so they want to keep him when they want something valuable back in return. So I just go into a trade negotiation with that in mind, and it makes it so much easier.
Yeah, and I mean, on the one hand, it's easier to make trades when there is a difference of opinion, right? If you all think the same thing about the exact same players, it tends to make the market a little rigid and slow to react, and it's harder to make those trades. And like I said, that's kind of the downside sometimes of the surplus calculator being a thing, that everybody sort of gets locked into that. But there's still plenty of reason. I mean, I make certain assumptions when I build my dollar values, and those assumptions aren't necessarily correct. And we talk about a lot about, there's been a recent discussion on Ottoneu Slack about that very thing. And there's assumptions built into that, and you change those assumptions slightly, and it changes those values, sometimes dramatically. So even though I have those values there and I think my system makes sense, it doesn't mean that I'm not making mistakes systematically, right? Beyond just whether you believe the projections or not on certain players. And there's plenty of reason to take the over or under on those projections as well. So,
and I think if you're playing in leagues where people are looking at the surplus calculator, or looking at the Fangraphs auction calculator, or looking at some other sort of set of values, I think that the best thing you can do is spend some time figuring out where you disagree with those systems, right? Who are the guys that you look at and you think, Justin just undervalues first baseman, and so I'm going to go try to trade for first baseman because I think he's just low on them. Or, this guy, the depth charts projections on him over on Fangraphs are too low. I think this guy's better than his projections. And so everybody who's using any system that's projection based to set a value is also going to be too low. And if you know that your league is heavily using those kinds of tools, that's where you can find an advantage, actually, is by finding those guys who are like, you know what? I know what the surplus calculator says about Dominic Smith. I think he's much better than that. And so I'm going to go see what I can do.
Well, one of the best ways to do that is to find playing time errors in a projection system. If you think if a player is projected for 400 plate appearances and you think he's going to get 600, then you go after that player because he's not valued like he should be.
Right, exactly. And there's still plenty of avenues to make those hedges against the projections. And that's what those dollar values in the surplus calculator, that's what they're based on. They're based on the Fangraphs depth charts projections, which are a mix of Zips and Steamer. So hedging against or making a modification to what you think those projections should be, then that's going to change, that value that's in there by default. So, but like I said, it's there as a baseline, and that's all it ever should have been. When I first released the tool, it was, well, I have to put some values in here, because if I don't, it doesn't do anything, right? Like there's nothing to look at if there aren't dollar values loaded into it, to look at the team totals and things like that. So.
And Justin will tell you, we have one league where right before the trade deadline in January, the keeper deadline just passed, I sent him a trade offer that was like 3 or 4 guys on my team, all of whom the surplus calculator said had surplus. They all had like $2 to $4 surplus, none of whom I thought were keepers. I was like, I'm going to give you all these guys. I don't even remember what I asked for in return. It was somebody who didn't have surplus, though, who I thought did. He turned me down. So he's not just telling you to use it as a baseline and not get too caught up in it. He thinks that way as well. So you can take advantage of his values, because I tried and failed.
All I know is I really like seeing the dark green beside my name. I don't know why. It just makes me feel good.
You feel satisfied by that, yeah. And it's such a funny thing in that way that, as I mentioned, I was talking with Niv, that like the thing I love about the surplus calculator is just that it can feel, when you start seeing all the rules, you start seeing all these things, feel a bit intimidating. And what I love about this is the first thing we did, because I was like the same way as Mark, when we decided we were going to do this league, the first thing I did was download the auction, the surplus calculator, and like it just made everything feel a little bit more like, I don't know, like just less intimidating. So I think it's a really good tool for new players to look at, and like I found it just by Googling the Ottoneu surplus calculator. So it's pretty easy to get a hold of, pretty easy to find. Now, looking at where we are as a league, to kind of give an idea for people who are, obviously there are newcomers into their like new restarted leagues or things like that, or just started leagues. But when you come into it somewhere like we are, where you're in the midpoint between, the ending of one season and going into the next one before your draft, kind of fill us in. Do you have any kind of strategies or any kind of thoughts of ways you like to go about preparing for that draft, or like doing evaluations to see what you want to, how you want to approach that draft?
Well, I'll start real quick. The one thing I would say is that because this league that we're talking about, this Pitcherless Ottoneu League, is going into its second season, I've done some posts in the past about league, or I should say Ottoneu-wide league keeper averages and inflation rates, and broken that out by league age. And what I found, and I found this consistently every year, is going into a second-year league, there's basically no inflation. And there's a lot of reasons. We could take a lot of time discussing why that might be the case, but in a lot of times it's no inflation, or there's even deflation, where it's negative inflation, and you're getting discounts at auction above and beyond what you would get even in a first-year league. This year in particular, because of the short 2020 season, I think, again, this is a topic that we could spend 45 minutes talking about. And I think we've mentioned it a few times on the Autobot podcast that I do with Chad and Niv. Mm-hmm. That unique short season, I think, has caused even more negative inflation across the board. Even in older leagues, there's leagues with negative inflation. So there's some weird mechanism right now where a lot of leagues are seeing a lot of players available in auctions, a lot of players cut. High-priced players capped, though, because that's really what drives that negative inflation, is if players are capped at a price that exceeds their value, at least according to, when I'm quoting all this, it's based on the values I have loaded in the surplus calculator. That's what I was doing all that based on. But this particular league is no exception. I mean, you've got an older version. I'm not exactly sure why that doesn't have up-to-date dollar values. But the version that I have shows negative 11% inflation for this league.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is different. And so again, I'm not exactly sure that that does look like last year's version of the calculator.
Oh, okay.
So that could explain. It could be loading in last year's dollar values, but I'm showing negative 11%, which implies that when you guys are going into your second year auction here, that players are going to come at a discount. Now, I think Chad and I have talked about this, that maybe not so much at that top tier, that the top free agents available when you're looking at, like I'm looking at the free agent list right now, Garrett Cole, Cody Bellinger, Christian Yelich, Max Scherzer, Nolan Arenado. That list maybe isn't going to come at a discount, but I think what you're going to see is then as you go down the list in that middle tier, there's going to be a lot of value available. So given that, my impression is that the teams that didn't keep a lot of players and they have more money available to spend at the auction are in a much better position, because they can leverage that money and get more value than they otherwise normally would. Because in a lot of leagues with very high inflation, you want to do the opposite. You want to keep some of these guys. Don't go into auction with $250 because you're not getting $1 for every dollar you have to spend. You're getting 75 cents. Where in this particular league and in most second year leagues, you can cut pretty aggressively knowing that there's going to be talent available at the auction, and you can probably get them at a reasonable, almost first year, and in this case, even a deflated price. So
that was my hope. That was really my hope when I made my cuts, was that there'd be deflation. And I think that has mostly to do with the fact that we spent so much in the first year draft. We felt like we go from a $260 budget that we're used to in other auctions to a $400 budget. We just said, well, I want this player, I'm going to spend more. And that's exactly what we did. And most of us, from the looks of the players who are sent back, decided that was just way too much money to spend.
Right. And another thing that I want to point out too is that most Ottoneu leagues are the Fangraphs points format. And when we talk on the podcast and things like that, and a lot of the content that's out there for Ottoneu is specifically oriented to the points formats. So a lot of dollar values that get thrown around are like Trout is worth $70 or Juan Soto 65. But in 5x5 for Ottoneu, I don't think the price curve is that high, that the top end is really maybe capped at $55. And that was one of we did our very first episode of the Ottonewbs podcast was recapping this draft that you guys had.
Oh, really? That's right.
Yeah. And one of the takeaways we had at the time was, that the teams, again, and Mark is an example of this. I remember that was one of the things that you did was not spending at that top tier, sort of living in the middle. And my opinion before the season started was the teams that were going to do well were probably the teams that avoided the top tier entirely, because they were going for much higher prices than I thought they should. Yeah. And I think Mary's team was another example of that, and you guys already mentioned it earlier in the stream, right? That Mary and Mark really sort of lived in the middle, and I think that benefited them in the long run during the season. So
yeah, I was in a terrible position during the draft because I had my list of values and everything was blowing over them. It was $12, $14 over. And I thought to myself, are my values wrong? Like, have I done something wrong here? And eventually they started to drop closer to what I expected. And that's when I jumped in. It ended up being the right thing. My values were correct. It was that the inflation, the prices were just so high. And if I had known that to start with, I would have been even more savvy in the auction. But I just started to panic. That's why I bought Buehler. That's why I bought Rendon, because I thought my values are wrong. And if I follow these values for the rest of the draft, I'm going to have no players.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's a very natural reaction. And if you don't have a lot of confidence in what, I mean, because you guys were all new to, you already mentioned it, right? You were all new to Ottoneu. Yeah. All 12 people playing in this league were brand new to it. So there's a learning curve there as far as what should we be spending on Mike Trout? What price is reasonable? And as you said, in a lot of the other roto leagues that you play in that are auction leagues, it's a $260 cap. So now you have that additional complication that now you have to scale it to a completely different scale as well with 40 roster spots. So yeah, and I've been in those moments myself where I have a set of values and my personal dollar values, and then everybody's going higher than that, and you're like, do I jump in here? Because if I don't, like you said, Mark, maybe I'm not going to get anybody, that I want. I'm not going to. I can't have a team full of $10 players. Like that's not going to win.
You're probably still a year away from this in this league, but as leagues get a little older, that actually becomes a more important change to make, because you do hit a point in some of the older leagues where there's only so much talent available in the auction. And in those leagues, if you sit there and go, look, sorry, Garrett Cole's going for way more than my prices say, your next choice might be 35 pitchers down the list. And if you've gone into an auction thinking, I need an ace, where am I going to get that ace? You sometimes have to be willing to spend on that because you need that production. In a second-year league, certainly I wouldn't do it in a first-year league. In a second-year league, you probably don't either. Based on what I'm seeing here, I would be – this is an auction where I think if you stick to your values and you trust your values, you're going to be very happy. And you're going to walk away. You probably won't walk away with Bellinger or Yelich or Cole, but you probably will walk away with some really good prices on guys like Matt Olson, on maybe a Yasmani Grandal, Marcus Semien. There's a bunch of guys who I think are going to fall into that next tier down, and you'll be able to get some really, really good deals there.
And the other benefit there is you're not getting that deal just for this year, right? If you get a good discount on a player that you then provide surplus value to keep them next year, or to, as Mark said, when he had some of those surplus values, he tried to leverage those to make a push to win the league, because that's what rebuilding teams that find themselves out of the running, they want those surplus assets for the future. And sometimes that's a prospect that makes the major leagues and breaks out right away. And sometimes that's just a player who came at a discount at the auction. And in hindsight now says, well, this guy was $5, too cheap. And that surplus exists. And, you kind of win on both ends. You're getting that excess production now, but you can also turn that into, win now production by trading them to a team that's rebuilding. So, it's one of the things we talk about on the podcast a lot. Like I'm a very price sensitive Ottoneu manager when I'm in an auction, and it's all driven on, am I getting somebody at a price that I think is reasonable? And I don't want to exceed that, because you guys were talking about Frankie Lindor, and yes, everybody should have players on their roster that they want to have on the roster that are fun. The joke is that I'm robotic in everything that I do with it. I like to have fun too. And I like to have players that I'm irrationally attached to. And there's nothing wrong with that. But in aggregate, you just have to be mindful of, if I do that for too many players, it catches up to you eventually. And a lot of Ottoneu is a game of maximizing your cap space, your roster spots. And that's the game, right? Like if you want to succeed, that's what you have to do. Everybody has $400 and 40 roster spots, but how do you squeeze more out of those assets, that currency, than everybody else in the league? And that's the name of the game, basically.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is that, so going to use the Lindor example, is the guy who owns Lindor. And so the interesting thing is, to give you an idea of the trap you're talking about, I went into it thinking I wanted one 5 category guy. And, that was my thing. I wanted one guy who contributed across the board. I was like, that's a foundational piece. And I paid to get it. And I think I'm a decent, whatever price for him. But then the interesting question is, and this is less about obviously fixing my team and just kind of everyone's, we have this interesting mix in the league of guys who created a ton of space, and we joke that the guys who create all the space are the guys who tend to be our price enforcers, which is going to be a real they're the auction bullies in our auction last year. But then if you are a team on the we have a couple teams in the middle, but then if you're a team on the other end of the spectrum, where you've got most of your team built, say, in $100 to spend, and you need to kind of fill out a little bit of your starting roster, something like that, $200. Or something, well, that's pretty big, but, something smaller than 100. How are you kind of going about planning that out? You've got your stars and your thing, your foundation kind of, if you're a team with a little bit of cap space, do you have a kind of strategies you like to use then?
I think regardless of whether I have a lot or a little bit, I like to go into an auction with a good sense of what I need. Mm-hmm. And for me, the way I tend to think about it, for a long time, the way I would think about it is, oh, I need a shortstop and I could use a star shortstop and I've got some good outfielders, so I could use some second tier outfielders, and I would start putting dollar figures and sort of budgeting out. I'm going to spend $40 on a shortstop and 15 on 3 outfielders and all this stuff. And what I've come to realize is it's really useful for me to think about those price tiers and the positions I need as a matrix of sorts, right? So that I know I want a $40 bat. I know I need a shortstop, but those two things don't have to go together necessarily. And that has helped give me some flexibility to say, well, I wanted like a 3rd, 4th, 5th outfielder plus a shortstop, but it's okay if I get an extra top outfielder and my shortstop is a little bit lower down, right? That balances out over the course of my roster. But that's how I try to go into it, again, regardless of how much money I have, with this sense of, I need a couple of big bats, a couple of lower tier bats, 1 ace, 3 other pitchers, and a bullpen. And here's roughly the positions I need and stuff like that. And then try to check off boxes as I go, right? So, if I need a shortstop and I want a high-end shortstop, and I'm doing a slow auction right now where that was exactly what I needed. I needed 1 or 2 sort of big bats, and I was going to try to get like a $35 or $40 Lindor and like a $15 outfielder. And it didn't work out. Lindor ended up going for like 44, 45. I decided it wasn't going to work for me in that league the way my team was structured. And I ended up with a $26 Carlos Correa and then going a little over $20 to get Kyle Schwarber. Right. And so I didn't think I was going to get an outfielder as good as Schwarber. And I thought I'd get a shortstop better than Correa. But in the end, what I did was I was able to look at and say, okay, well, I know I need to spend, 50-ish bucks on my top 2 bats. And it doesn't matter how that breaks down as long as I walk away with 2 bats that are worth that $50. And so I think that's what you need to do, is be focused on that, not a very specific, I'm going to go pay this much money for my starting shortstop, but I have a sense of like, I want a couple of bats in the $30 range, a couple of bats in the $10 range, and they need to be spread across these positions.
That makes a lot of sense, and gives you that nice flexibility that you're not player specific. You're more, I like that.
And I think get some values too.
Well, and that's what I was going to say, right? Is if you put yourself in a position where you don't feel pressure to get a certain position, or you have flexibility already on your roster with multi-eligible positional players, you can take advantage of those values as they fall. And that's very much how I approach auctions. Is I want to hammer value. I want to bid up to the price that I think I want to get a certain amount of discount on every player that's available. And if it exceeds that point, okay, I'm not interested anymore. But I don't want to feel like, I have 3 catchers that I kept, and now a bunch of catchers are going for really good values. Like, it's just like, oh, I wish I could get in on this. Or it happens a lot at first base, especially, right? Where you have 2 first basemen. You can't really use functionally a 3rd first baseman in Ottoneu. You've got 1 at first base. You've got 1 that you slot in at util. And now all the stud first baseman's going for $10 less than you think you should, but you really can't get involved because you're really going to put yourself in a bind. Now, I think somebody like Chad, and we've talked about this on the podcast too, sometimes you can get involved and do that, and then know that you have an excess at first base or at any other position, and then you make a trade early in the season to leverage the excess you have at that position to try to improve somewhere else. Me, that's a little harder for me to do. I'm not quite as active in trading, and I don't want to depend on having to make a trade to capitalize on what I thought was a good deal at the time. Especially because if you win him for $8 and you think he's worth 13, everybody else in the league is going to say, well, he's only an $8 player. No, he's not. He's a $13 player. Don't look at his salary, look at what he's actually worth. So
I think if you're going to do that, the way to make it work is to trade the guys you already had, right? So the way to do that is if you've got 2 $20 first basemen that you're going to put at first base and util, you're super happy with them, and all of a sudden there's a guy that you think is a $15 first baseman out there that you can get for $7, go get him for $7, trade one of the $20 guys, right? Because Justin's right. Everyone in the league's going to be like, I'm not that excited about that $7 first baseman. I could have had him a week ago, right? I could have bid $8 and he would have been mine, and I wouldn't have had to give you the second baseman or shortstop or prospect you're asking for. But that $20 guy that you kept, somebody else in your league probably thinks he's a $25 guy and wishes he was in the auction, and you can trade that guy. And for me, the way I make sure I've got room for that is in that when I make that list of positions I need, I always have a couple of spots that I label as TBD. And those are sort of like, I know I want at least 8 outfielders, and 9th is usually pretty good. I know I want at least 8 or 9 starting pitchers. I can get another there. I usually like to have room for prospects. But that to me is where value comes in. And I don't necessarily need to have 3, 4, 5 prospects on my team. I don't necessarily need that 9th outfielder, that 9th starting pitcher. That's where I can be a little bit flexible and say, I've got these 2 spots that when something pops up that I go, oh, I don't even need that guy, but he's too good a value to pass up. They slot into that TBD space for me. And it gives me just that little added flexibility to say, yeah, no, I'm jumping in on this 3rd first baseman that I don't need because the value's too good. And I think, that spot in general for me ends up going to a prospect if I don't find another value somewhere else. But a $15 first baseman, a $15 value at first base that you pay $7 for is better than getting a prospect. Right. And so, yeah, you could say, no, I don't need that. I was going to go get a $4 guy in AAA. Well, they're both not going to be in your lineup, but one of them's worth a lot more than the other. And so to me, that's where, give yourself that flexibility. Don't get bogged down in like an underpriced guy that you never put in your lineup is just as good as a prospect, if not better.
And so, kind of looking at that, to when you go into your draft, obviously you're looking to, you have to fill your starters, you have to fill everything you're looking to do within that. And I guess the first question I would have is to follow that up. Do you have any, if you're looking for value, you talk about value and surplus, aside from what the calculator is telling you, do you have any kind of like archetypes you often look for? I know Mark mentioned playing time being one of them, but anything you kind of like, I suspect there might end up being some surplus here.
That's the $1 million question in a lot of ways, right? I mean, sometimes that could take the form of sort of a structural approach, right? I know that myself and a lot of other Ottoneu managers, especially in the points formats, we feel that relievers maybe are easier to find during the season, and you can speculate on the back end a lot more. So maybe you don't want to pay $20 for 3 relievers because you have a better avenue to use that money, that investing $20 is more important at shortstop or as a 5th outfielder than it would be at the top of the bullpen, for example. So a lot of it comes down to things like that, like structurally, where do I think this money is best spent? What are the best paths for me to improve my roster during the season? If it's easy for me to find a reliever, if it's easy for me to find outfielders, if they're commonly available during the season, then maybe I'm less interested in them. Maybe similar to prospect, right? Like at the auction, I don't really want to pay $6, $7, $8 for the top prospect when there are prospects that sort of bubble up during the season that you can get that's the thing about Ottoneu is you're constantly, you have that entire pool and those players break out during the season, even if it's at AA, and you start a 48-hour auction for them and maybe you get them for $2. I'd much rather spend $2 on a prospect that's a little further down the prospect list than a top 20 prospect, but have to pay $9 for them. I mean, that price delta matters so much to me. So it's a lot of little things like that where I feel like the money that I'm going to spend, I want it to be most impactful as possible. And that's a lot of what it boils down to. And yes, sometimes that means you do want to target younger players because you do want that future potential. But for me, it's less about the hot names and the sleepers because they always get pushed up, right? I mean, they're just, you guys talked about Wander Franco, and that price it's such a high price that even if he came up last year for the last month of the season and mashed, he still probably wasn't going to be worth $20 anytime soon. And it's just, to me, like I'd rather take a chance on the lower end of that price spectrum and have more opportunity for profit in the future. So
I think there's a couple of things I would say. One is, to me, there's surplus is the production a guy provides you or the value he has to you above what he costs, right? And so one of the ways I find surplus is I go after guys I like, right? Having, and it's like a running joke on the podcast because I talk about Dom Smith nonstop because I just love the guy. Having him on my team has added value to me beyond his production. And so one of the ways I find surplus is I go pay for the guys I want to have on my team. And I think that has real value. And especially when I want them on my team because I believe that they're better than the market believes they are, right? It adds in. The other area I look is large tiers at a position where I like a lot of players. And so the example we just did for the Ottonewbs podcast, our first base, we just recorded our first base episode. It should come out next week. And we talked about I talked a lot about how there's this tier of first base when you get Freddie Freeman at the top. You've got a long tail of sort of talented first basemen, but you've got this group that's sort of that second tier that for me, sort of down to the top 10-ish, where I like Matt Olson, I like Rhys Hoskins, I like Josh Bell, I like Paul Goldschmidt, I like Luke Voigt. There's a bunch of guys in that tier who I think could have very good seasons who I'm really excited about. And what that means is I can sit in an auction where a bunch of those guys are available and just see which one of them comes up as a good price, because one of them will, right? If there's 6 of them, one of them is going to be a good value. You don't know which one, and you don't want to get bogged down in like, oh, Hoskins has to be the guy. Don't get too focused on that. Maybe it's Pete Alonso, maybe it's Matt Olson, but one of those guys is going to go for $5-6 less than you think, $3-4 less than you think, and when that happens, you just be prepared to jump at it.
Yeah, Ariel Cohen calls that the a hot spot, where all these players are basically interchangeable. You just take the best value. One thing that I do when I'm in a draft, is when it comes to things to look for value is just finding players who you don't think will be in the roster spot, in the lineup spot that they are on roster resource. So if you've got a guy like Carlos Santana who is listed as maybe the 5th batter or the 6th batter, and you think he's going to bat second, well, then you bump him up a little bit because he gets those added plate appearances, and he has more opportunity to score runs and knock people in. So those are on top of playing time. Also, players like a Roman Quinn, who is the first to step in if Andrew McCutchen gets injured, and he's at the age where he may get injured, and he often takes time off. Well, you could get a good value on Roman Quinn and if he ends up stepping into a severe injury or gets that added playing time, then you're banking all that extra value. So these are things that I look for in every draft, but I'm going to be paying close attention to in this Ottoneu auction coming up.
Yeah, so you're essentially thinking, Mark, not to go fantasy football here, but you think about handcuffing players, essentially, right?
Yeah, a little bit, but I'm also going for the players that I like. This is how you find sleepers. If you step into an extra 400 plate appearances, you've got your value right there. So you've got to know the player pool, and if you don't get them in the auction, then you need to be able to have enough money that you can win them when Andrew McCutchen does get injured and step in season.
And that's been another topic recently on the Ottoneu Slack, was the conversation about how much money to not spend at auction, right? In a lot of auction fantasy leagues, the money you spend at the auction, that's it. There's no usefulness for that money beyond the auction. That's not true in Ottoneu because you don't have a separate fab budget to make free agent pickups. You're essentially using whatever cap space or your ability to free up that cap space from your existing $400. So it can be useful to have $20, $25 not spent at the auction going into the season, because every day of the season gives us more information about how good these players are and which players, as Mark said, roles change and lineup positions change, and having that information in April, a week after the season starts. Yeah, don't overreact to a hot start or a bad start, from a player after a week. But if there's a role change, if there's an opportunity change, that's something that I like to have that money available early in the season, because a lot of teams they don't have the ability to cut and have money to spend because they like all their players, right? The auction just ended. You don't want to cut guys you just acquired at the auction. And I've made this mistake a lot in the past, where I was so focused on buying all those values, that discount that I'm talking about, that I had spent $400 every single time, because there was always somebody on the table that I thought was a value. And I handcuffed my ability to be flexible and to have that liquidity to take advantage of those early auctions, because there's a lot of really important players that are available during the first few weeks of every fantasy baseball season and fantasy football season. I mean, any fantasy season really. And I want to be in a position to take advantage of that. Now, I don't think leaving $50 on the table is a good idea. I think the number is much lower than that, but giving yourself a little flexibility going into the season to make those early pickups, I think is pretty important. So.
Yeah, and you can tell we talked about it when we looked at Zach's team. Zach won the league, and he had a lot of in-season pickups. He had the Cronenworth and the Valdez, and he had the players that shone during the season, and he had the money to buy them. And I bid on them. I bid on every single one of them, but I just didn't have enough.
Right. And the other mechanism that can happen sometimes is you can. After you cut a player, you guys talked about this earlier, there is a cap penalty. 50% of their salary you incur as a cap penalty until that player is either claimed on waivers or somebody else re-auctions them. You yourself can re-auction them 30 days after you cut them. And then if you do that and nobody else jumps into the bidding, then you can cut them again. And basically you keep cutting the cap penalty in half. Well, at a certain point, you can never get any lower than that $1 cap penalty unless somebody else jumps in and wins that player. So if the reason I bring that up is if you're an auction and you win a player for $1 and then that player is never worth anything the rest of the season, you're never getting rid of that $1 cap penalty. And that's the other thing it was a lesson that I sort of took away is there are a lot of sleepers that I won for $1 and then they ended up being duds. Well, I'm stuck with that $1. There's no way to get rid of it because no one else wants that player and I'm never getting rid of that cap penalty. So that's another reason for me that sometimes I don't want to take as many chances in that range unless it's a player I'm really confident is going to have value to everybody else and to me for the rest of the season. I don't like taking chances on guys that have a high probability of being completely worthless to every other team in my league. So
you make that cap penalty sound so nefarious. You're like, you're never getting rid of that.
But you know what? It adds up. I mean,
for life.
there are a lot of situations where you have maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 guys that are just stuck for $1 cap penalty, and sometimes every dollar can really matter. It keeps you $1 from bidding on a prospect in July after the Major League Baseball draft or something like that. I mean, yeah, it's only $1, but I'm just pointing out that sometimes you get stuck with these players that you have that cap penalty and it just sits there on your roster the whole year and just grates at you. It does to me. I mean, maybe I'm alone in that, but it's just one thing to keep in mind that if you have a player that nobody else wants, you're never going to get rid of that last dollar.
So then also looking at other ways of sort of, building teams or, going about getting creative, especially like if you're a cap strap team or things like that, where do you guys fall on either like platoon players or players that like, say you can get a guy who's a good end of a platoon for, you can get both ends of a platoon or something for $1 or $2, since the rosters are so deep, do you ever sometimes think about going that route as well?
Yeah, for sure. Platoon players are really valuable in Ottoneu, more so than in most other formats because of those deep rosters. The thing I would caution is you don't need both ends of a platoon, right? And I think Niv and I are co-managing a team this year where we had Alex Dickerson and Austin Slater. Just happen to have those two. We hit the keeper deadline and we're talking about like, okay, well, what are we doing with these two? We're definitely keeping Dickerson, but what about Slater? And the first thought is both ends of the platoon combined, we're paying them, way less than their combined worth. But Slater's still the small end of a platoon. And he's only going to play in a third of games or start a third of games, maybe even less. And so we can pair Dickerson with another strong side of a platoon from some other team or some other situation and get way more value out of that. And so I think platoon players are really valuable, but I think it's worth remembering that the small side of a platoon is still a small side of a platoon and is still worth a lot less than the big side, even if you've got the big side already on your roster.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of hidden surplus in those platoon players, and I agree with Chad that like you want to focus on the strong side, somebody that you can use 2/3 of the time. But there's a lot of value in that because sometimes it's hidden, right? It's obscured by people like me that are looking at a full season projection. And it really isn't properly accounting for the fact that this player is really valuable against right-handers and below replacement against left-handers. That average for the full season may be a $5 player, but really, if you only play them against right-handers, functionally, he's a $10 player. And that happens a lot. So I think that's another, Daniel, you asked a question earlier about how we find those edges and find surplus. And I didn't think of it at the time, but yeah, this conversation, absolutely platoon advantage and focusing on, and that's easier to do at positions like catcher and outfield, where you sort of have enough roster spots and the opportunity to mix guys, and you almost have to, right? Because you have so many outfield games you need to try to maximize. You kind of have to take advantage of some platoon situations, but catcher especially is easy to do that because you have 2 catcher slots, but you still have a 162 game cap at the catcher position. So it's not technically a 2 catcher game, Ottoneu. It's really a 1 catcher game, but the flexibility to start 2 in any given day. And then you can really run platoons really effectively at the catcher position in Ottoneu. So
when you're looking at projections, just make sure you look at whether a guy is projected as a platoon guy or not. And I think Justin was starting to talk about this a little bit, but some guys are the strong side of a platoon and get projected for 110 games, and their stats are their stats. And that is what they're going to get because Zips and Steamer and everyone else are already looking at them and thinking they're only going to face lefties or only going to face righties or whatever it is. Other guys, like Justin was saying, they get projected for a full season. Because they get projected for a full season, the projection is off. And so it's not just, it's not just the guy can be worth more as a platoon player. It's that sometimes the projection actually shows him to be worth less than he really is. And so you've got to be really, it's to Mark's point about looking at plate appearances, looking at how often they're going to be in the lineup, looking at where in the lineup they're going to be. Is the projection actually showing how they're going to be used or not? Is another piece of this.
One thing that I discovered through this league was I had a lot of trouble in season because I felt like I was getting close to the innings limit cap and my games limit cap way too soon. I was playing, I had a full roster, full lineup every day because I put a healthy player in because he was starting. And it was fine because I was worried about playing time, that I wouldn't get close to the limit, but I got close to the limit way too early. So I dropped a lot in the standings in the last 3 weeks because I couldn't put anybody in a roster spot because I knew that I would blow over my catcher limit. I would blow over my first baseman limit because I had too many players cycling in and out every single day. And it really hurt me. So one thing I will do next year is I will make sure that when I do have a matchup that I like, that I get the player in, but I'm going to leave a lot more empty roster spots on given days if I don't like the matchup.
Yeah, I would strongly suggest there is on the set lineups page a thing at the bottom that shows you what you're pacing for at each position. Stay slightly ahead of the pace. You don't want to get too far ahead of the pace, but if you're at the pace or behind the pace, you're putting yourself at a little risk. Even I've been in situations where I'm like, I'm a couple games behind the pace, but I have 3 guys at this position I like. I'll make this up. It's much harder to make that ground up than you realize. And so if you can be pacing for 168 to 170 games over a full season at a given position, that's a good place to be. And then when you get to August, September, you start to dial it back a little bit. You're a little bit more cautious. And yeah, you might lose 3 or 4 games at the end of the year because of it. But that's better than being at the pace, having a guy get hurt, losing a week, finally replacing them, and then all of a sudden you're 6-7 games behind with a month left in the season, and you're just going to lose those.
So even if you have a platoon, it doesn't really help you unless you're really banging the strong side of the platoon and have that actual best matchup.
Yeah, especially because you don't want to waste a roster spot on a guy that's only helping you a little bit, right? Because those roster spots have value. So only being able to play them a third of the time during the season at most can hurt when he's taking up a full roster spot, basically. But and it's, I feel like a lot of this is not as big a deal in the roto leagues in the 5x5 or the 4x4 because you have rate stats and bulk stats. So there's not as much pressure to meet all of your games at every position or even all of your innings. There's an innings pitched minimum in 4x4, but there's not in 5x5. So you can strategically decide that you're not going to chase all those games. You're going to, try to balance the rates and the bulk stats. Whereas in the points leagues, a point is a point. And if you don't get full games played at all your positional caps and all of your innings, you're leaving points on the table. So there's a lot more pressure to maximize filling every single game of your games cap and your inning pitch cap. So that's where a lot of the platoons are necessary, because you just need to have a guy that's ready to go in the lineup every day. And the side effect of that sometimes is you get a roster crunch, right? You can't roster 8 prospects and fill all of your lineup spots and maximize your game and inning pitch caps, because there's just not enough space to do that, unless you get really lucky, like if none of your players get hurt, and that happens sometimes too. But you get a string of bad luck sometimes at a certain position, and you end up having to cut a prospect because you need to have somebody that can make up some shortstop games for you, or what have you. But
in those roto leagues, and I know this is a 5x5, it's really important to pay attention to where you are in the standings. And this is not an Ottoneu specific thing. This is true in anything. But if you're running really strong in the counting stats, you may not need to worry about filling every game. If you're behind in those counting stats and your rates are way ahead of everybody else, then you should push to fill those games, right? Because you have room to bring your rates down to bring up the counting stats. But that's always going to be in a roto league. That's always the trade-off you're going to make, right? Is when you play that guy who's 3rd, 4th down the list of guys you want to play because you're trying to fill out your games, you're probably going to hurt your rates, but the counting stats are still better than nothing. And so knowing where your team is, the original Ottoneu league is a 4x4 league, and that format is still my favorite. And one of the things I pay close attention to there is some years I'm going to fill out every single game because my on-base percentage and slugging look good, and I need the home runs and runs where I can get them. And some years I'm going to back off because I want to protect my rates, and I've got enough power coming from my home runs and runs that I can, slow down. I think it happens more with pitching than with hitting. I found that, that 1,500 inning pitch cap is super important in the points leagues, and not always in roto. It just depends what your team needs. And so knowing what your team needs then determines how you play things out, which then also allows you to do things like say, I don't need to fill out every single inning. I'm going to cut my 8th and 9th starting pitchers in order to add prospects so I can trade for something else, or who I can keep into next year, or another platoon outfielder because I need to make up those games somewhere. So being, the way you manage your roster is really dependent on how your roster is performing and where you fall into a lot of those areas.
So I guess the next sort of thought too is, looking into a second-year draft and things like that, especially in a weird year, as you were mentioning before, coming off of just the 60 games and, basically everything is a small sample size at this point for last year. How do you approach, I guess, given that obviously, not to say that making the wrong investment in a thing can be punitive, but obviously, as we're talking about, it can be. If you got a guy like, say, a Giancarlo Stanton, or even like we talked about, Mark and I talked about earlier about like Charlie Blackmon, who had a terrible year, but again, 60 games and, or, things like that. How do you approach in this situation when you talk about what you want to invest in a player that you think is going to rebound? Is that kind of something you say, well, I'm just going to, like you talked about, Chad, set a dollar amount at, and that's what I do? Or is there some kind of thought process that you go through when you look at that?
I think one of the things with a guy like Blackmon is knowing that at half his salary, whatever you pay him, at half his salary, will people buy him back? And the reason I mention that is if you buy him at auction and he gets out the gate and he is struggling and you're like, forget it, I don't think he's going to bounce back. I paid $30 for him. I just don't think he's worth it. You can cut him at $30. And if somebody else is willing to pay $15 for him, you'll clear that whole $30. You will force other people to make cuts and make decisions on what else is going on. And you may get an opportunity to pick up some other pieces because of it. If you start getting to a point where you're paying a guy $60 and there's no way he's, if he falls apart, he'll be worth $5, Then you're talking about you cut him in April and you cut him again in May and you cut him again in June, and you're whittling away that cap penalty, which is great. At least you're whittling it away, but you're not sort of creating any churn or moving dollars around for anyone else that might give you an opportunity to benefit from it. I know Justin is a big fan of that move, of the sort of cutting a high price guy that you think other people will want and causing a little bit of fallout, especially if people have overspent at the auction and nobody's got cash lying around. But in general, other than that will then have an impact on what price point I'm willing to go for a guy. But it doesn't change the fact that when I hit the price point that I want a guy at, I'll pay for it. And if I don't hit that price point, I won't. I'm going to be, I try to stick to my values, right? And so that just, it has a small impact on the values. There are cases where I might say, man, I think this guy might be a $40 player, but I think if I cut him at 20, I'd be stuck with that cap penalty. So I might cap at 30 to limit my risk. But it's a pretty rare occurrence, I think. In general, if I think a guy's a $40 guy, I'm going to pay 40 for him.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right there with Chad as far as, sticking to what I think my max bid should be. But I will say that sometimes those players that underperformed in the prior season, especially if they're a veteran and there's an idea that maybe they're just done, sometimes those are good targets to scoop some value, because nobody wants, we were talking about Joey Votto when we did our first base preview episode. It wouldn't shock me if he was worth, $10 or $15 this year in Ottoneu. But he might not go anywhere near that, because there might be an impression that he's done and he's not going to put up that performance. And even if he does, he's only going to play for so many more years. But sometimes those underperforming veterans from the prior year are good targets to get a little bit of a discount. And it's boring discount, but it's a discount nonetheless. Sometimes you can't get exciting discounts because those exciting players, everybody is excited for them, and the price just keeps going and going and going, and then you either have to just swallow it and keep going if you want him, or you have to say, look, I'm going to be rational here, and I'm not going to chase after the $20 Wander Franco. So,
all right, yeah.
I'm going to just throw out one last thing, which is, I agree with you. I think Joey Votto is worth $10 to $15 this year. I think he's a super interesting guy, and I think he is a free agent in this league, and somebody should spend for him, because I think he'll have a good year. And with that, I unfortunately got to go. Daniel, thank you so much for inviting me. Good luck, Mark and Daniel, in this auction. It looks like it's going to be a fun one. There's a lot of talent out there and a lot of dollars to be thrown around, so it should be exciting.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us. We're really looking forward to it. Maybe I think we were talking about probably we'll live cast the draft, but we might also do a recap afterwards. So maybe we'll have to have you back on. And
love that.
Somehow we screwed it up.
Thanks for ruining my Joey Votto pick, by the
way. Maybe nobody else is paying attention.
Oh, thanks so much again, Chad. I appreciate you coming out and joining us.
Thank you.
Go Cleveland. All right, so yeah, I guess we'll just wrap up in a little bit, but a couple other things maybe to kind of talk about. Maybe the first thing, I guess, the one thing that I always get asked about, Justin, maybe you have some insight on it if you haven't talked about it on the pod, is do you have the last sort of general draft question, do you have any specific nomination strategies you like to use, or anything you like to think about when you're thinking about who to nominate?
Yeah, I actually had a post in Rotographs a few years ago where I talked about sort of the general flow of an Ottoneu auction. And one of the things that I talked about, and we sort of alluded to it earlier when Chad was talking about, multiple options at a certain tier, but one of the effects that you see all the times, and this isn't exclusive to Ottoneu, it's really any auction system for these fantasy leagues, is it's all about what else is available. And sometimes, let's say you've got the number one starting pitchers available, and then number two, number three, and then there's a big gap, right, to the next range. Sometimes if you nominate the top pitcher, people aren't necessarily going to jump on that price because there's two other compelling options there. But once those first two guys go and that third pitcher's there, and then there's a big gap, that third pitcher can go for more than the first and second pitcher because there's no other compelling option at an equivalent value. And you'll see these little bubbles that burst at the positional scale. So I think one of the draft strategies that I would say is, if you can, pay attention to where those tiers are, and you don't want to be caught having feeling like you have to bid on the last player at a certain position, at a certain tier within a position, because there's often going to be a premium paid for that player. And then on the other end of that scale, sometimes is if you're the first team to nominate. Now, in Ottoneu, in a returning league, the 12th place team will get the first nomination of the draft. Sometimes it's advantageous to throw out a name that you do want. I know the common tip for auctions is nominate people you don't want to drive the money out. But sometimes if you have that first nomination or an early nomination, you can nominate someone and they'll actually go for a discount, where the rest of the league is sort of feeling out what the prices are going to be. What are really the effects of inflation, right? And sometimes you can get a discount. You can sneak in a discount with that first nomination that everybody quickly adjusts, and then all of a sudden the prices get back in line where you expect them to be. But sometimes that first nomination can actually be a discount. So I think those are the big two tips as far as navigating the auction and paying attention to those tiers. In general, yes, I do still want to nominate players that I'm not interested in, because I want everyone else to have as little money as possible so I can maximize the utility of my auction dollars. But and the other nice thing that the surplus calculator does is on the team totals page, you can see the auction money available per each team. You can see that in the draft as well. But then I do also have that dollar available per spot. And that sort of gives you that purchasing power, almost like a max bid proxy, where if you have $20 available per spot, you can really, you don't have to save a lot of money for because you have 25 roster spots yet to fill. You can really put in a really big max bid, whereas somebody else, the Archie's there with $1.06 per spot. Like the max bid then is only like $5 for that particular team. And so if you can what I like to do is I also have an average on the bottom, right? So in this league, in the Pitcher List Ottoneu League, the average team has $130 to spend at auction, and they have $8 per spot. I like to try, if I can, I like to try to keep my team throughout the auction right around the average, so that I'm not spending too much too early. And I'm also not, I don't always want to have necessarily the most money available at auction in the middle of the auction, because it might mean I didn't take advantage of winning players when they were available, because at a certain point, the well runs dry and there's just not a whole lot to purchase, especially if I need a certain amount of value, if I'm trying to be competitive. So sort of keeping an eye on that and seeing where you fall in that range can give you an idea of, well, I'm in dollar days and I really just can't bid on anybody, or I have the most money by far, so I should take advantage of that and really try to push, while still being sensitive to values, because I'm still going to be price sensitive, but take advantage of the fact that I have the most money. So let's try to spend some of that and then get back into a sort of an average range. Sometimes that's easier said than done, but that's something I do try to pay attention to while I'm in the middle of an auction. So, yeah.
So I'm just going to jump in and ask you a quick question looking at this grid.
Sure.
What do you think David is going to not have to do, but be able to do with this kind of power of having only 8 roster spots to fill, and clearly way, way, way more per available spot than the rest of us?
And here's a situation where a lot of what I was talking about as far as being price sensitive, some of that goes out of the window if you're rebuilding, or if you're in a certain position where you're not always buying players because you want to compete, but you're buying them because you want to get assets to flip, right? We talk about this on the podcast a lot. Sometimes it is a good strategy if you're realistically saying to yourself, I'm not going to compete in this league, I'll overspend on a premium bat or a premium pitcher because I'm going to flip them in season and get a lot more value than I would have if I kept that money and tried to spread it around to some surplus assets. So in his particular case, I mean, the surplus calc is saying 6th place, so that's not really a rebuilding team necessarily. But with that few positions and that much money to spend, I mean, he should be involved in every single one of those top free agents on the list. The Garrett Cole, Cody Bellinger, Christian Yelich, Max Scherzer, every single one of those tier. Because at a certain point, if he doesn't win some of those players with so few roster spots left, he might leave $40 or $50 on the table, which, as I said earlier, is probably too much.
Yeah. The problem for him, I think, is going to happen is he's going to start bidding on one of the top players, and everybody else is not going to be able to compete with him. And so, because there are so many players available as free agents, I mean, most of us can grab 1 or 2, but he can grab. He can. I
He
suspect what's going to end up happening is he's going to lose a few. It's going to deplete the money available to other managers, and then he's just going to be able to step in and get a Rendon for $24 and a Bueller for $24 and a Scherzer for $24 because nobody else will have any kind of money.
Yeah, that could certainly be true. The only thing I would say to push back on that a little bit is that there are a couple teams with 200 plus. I mean, $278 is a lot of money to spend, but that's also a lot of roster spots to fill. So there's a lot more consideration to still filling out a full roster. But yeah, I mean, I think he's going to have to be very active with those early top tier players, and he'll probably come away with 3 or 4 of them at decent prices. So. I mean, he's a veteran, right? Like you guys, he didn't start the league. He took over for somebody who, which obviously was what we were talking about, taking over a team. But he's a veteran. He's played Ottoneu before, I know.
Yeah, and we felt like we could add him now because we have that year of experience. I also really wanted to add somebody with a little bit of experience to kind of guide us a little bit more. Now that we know the basics, let's get somebody who knows exactly what they're doing so that we can kind of rise up to his level instead of us like floating around trying to figure it out on our own. Let's get somebody who knows what they're doing, who's taking over a team and can kind of show us the ropes a little bit. So that's why when we lost one of our managers, I asked him to join, and I'm really, really interested because his strategy is very different from the rest of us. Like, he's put himself in a different position than the rest of us. That's for sure.
And sometimes that's a really great thing to do. That I've talked about this too. Is you want to zig when the rest of your league is zagging. Sometimes, you know, when you were in that position where you were in the auction and all those top tier players were going for a much higher price, and you have those second thoughts of, did I make a mistake? Are the prices wrong on my end or what? But sometimes that can be a good thing, that you're not in lockstep with everybody else. And you know, it's silly, but like I think of like the Patriots and certain football teams that make those decisions, or the classic Moneyball example, right? Where the Oakland A's, they decided that there was a market inefficiency with certain types of players, the players that walked a lot that weren't, you know, weren't prized free agents because what they did wasn't as flashy, but were still very valuable in terms of what they brought to the table. And sometimes that is a thing to take advantage of in Ottoneu and in fantasy in general is, if you identify a situation where you can find players that for whatever reason are undervalued, or a strategy that is unique and can differ from everybody else, then you can pick up value that everybody else is going to ignore because they're not focused on that. They're focused on the Fernando Tatises of the world and not the Marcus Semyons, right? So.
Yeah, and you know, so then I guess going on the other side of the big, you know, if you see in a draft, you know, I guess for the rest of our league, because there's like 3 or 4 players with huge dollar amounts, right?
Yeah.
The entire rest of the league, to go the opposite way of it. What do you do, right? Like you're kind of, are you just gonna, how do you fight or combat essentially like a bully or price enforcer with a ton of money, or someone's just gonna be like, cool, I just outbid you for everyone. Like, is there a counter strategy to go the other way with that?
I mean, it can be hard, really. And especially if you're in a position where you don't have a lot of money, there's not much you can do. I mean, I would nominate the players that I think are at the top of the free agent list as the ones that I think are the most valuable, just to start driving some of that money out and bring my available money more in line with everybody else's. And that's the way to do it. Get just, you know, you're not going to win. If you've got $16 in the auction, you're not winning any of those top 30 players because you just can't afford to. And anybody, you know, in that range, that $60 range, it's not too dissimilar from that. It's just try to focus on, you know, and when I mentioned before about those tiers, is if you do want to win a player in those ranges, then try to nominate someone that could come at a value and is not the last player in the tier. Or, you know, I would talk about that example of the top 3 pitchers. Well, maybe you nominate the 5th or 6th best pitcher because you think you can sneak them by now and get a value for them. It doesn't always work, but if it doesn't work, then you just say, okay, well, that didn't work. Let's try again next time. Another thing that I like to do is, depending on the makeup of my roster, if I already have all the catchers I need, I'll just start nominating catchers. I don't want them. I don't need them. I'll just start nominating the best catcher available every single time until eventually I exhaust the list of available catchers that are worth nominating. So you can just sort of hammer down on a position that you already have everybody you want from that position. So it's not always about, I don't want this player, but I don't need this position. So you can nominate those players too, because you don't want players, and when you don't have very much money, you don't want players up for bid that you want, because then you don't have access to them right now. But if you can be patient, you wait an hour and a half, and all of a sudden you have as much money as everybody else, or maybe even slightly more. Now you can start nominating those players you want because you have more buying power. And it's very hard to do. I mean, I joke about it sometimes that I feel like I have more Ottoneu auction experience than almost anybody else because I have been in so many leagues for so long. I mean, Niv and Chad have been playing for a long time, but 1, 2, 3, 4 leagues maybe, but I've been playing 10 leagues a year for at least the last 6 or 7 years. And that's a lot of Ottoneu auctions, a lot of first-year Ottoneu leagues. You know, you guys know it was 8-9 hour draft for first-year league, which is on one hand daunting. On the other hand, it's a blast because it's just so much fun for so long. But if you're doing that 4 or 5 times every year, plus your 3-hour returning auctions, it really adds up. But the nice part is for me, like, I just have a lot of experience handling an Ottoneu auction. I don't always make all the right choices, but I'm familiar with the ebbs and flows that happen sometimes during these auctions. And, you know, and I have a very particular style as far as these are the players I want and these are the prices. And I'm very strict about that as much as I can be. And it works in the sense that I don't waste a lot of time worrying about, well, this guy's going higher than I keep wanting to +1. The other thing mechanically, by the way, I want to mention about the auction is you have to be careful. Sometimes there are buttons to do a +1 bid, a +5 bid, a +10 bid. I sometimes don't like using those buttons because you'll get stuck and somebody will jump the bid $10 and then you've hit +1 and now all of a sudden you're bidding $11 more than you thought you were. So sometimes there's a field where you can just type in the bid you want to make. Sometimes I will do that at the top end, rather than just doing +1 or +5 or whatever the case may be, because somebody else sneaks that bid in and now you're not bidding where you thought you were. Sometimes the system's good and it'll lock you out because your bid was too quick compared to somebody else who just jumped the bid. But sometimes, you know, there's enough time there that you can get stuck. And you don't want to be in that position where you really bid more than you meant to because you hit the +1 button, because it's easy to do. You just click it. Yeah. It's right there. Just hit +1.
Well, especially if the bids are going up quickly at +1.
Yeah.
And savvy managers will ding you with a $25.
And
you'll go +1 and you're like, no, I didn't mean to do that. And
there are a lot of
do it.
And there were a lot of Ottoneu veterans that's exactly what they're doing. They're doing that for a particular reason because they know someone's probably got a +1 that's in the queue that's about to hit, and they sneak in that $7 jump or that $10 jump. Yeah. And they know they're going to stick somebody. And they're probably still bidding at a price they like, but they know they're out. Like, this is their max bid. They enter it. It jumps it up $5 or $6. And if anybody else happens to +1 them, they might get stuck at a price they really didn't want.
And that's not something that happened in our draft a lot. It may have happened occasionally, but we weren't doing that. But if any of us were going to go and play in another league, pick up another a ghosted team or whatever, then we're kind of stepping into the sharks with the sharks, and that's a very, very easy thing to happen to somebody who's new to the game.
And before we wrap up, by the way, I absolutely would be remiss if I didn't echo something Mark said earlier. Daniel and Dave Sherman, you guys were rock stars. I couldn't imagine. I've live streamed drafts, okay, but I'm not really bouncing back and forth, and I'm just sort of, you know, it's just a thought that I'm having while I'm doing it, but I'm not really focused on the stream, right? You guys had a whole presentation for the entire time, and you were drafting, because when it first started, I'm like, they're not drafting while they're doing this, right? There's no way that both of them are drafting and doing this, but you were. So I have to say I was incredibly impressed by all of that, especially given it was your first time doing that. you're forgiven. I mean, I don't know what place you finished in. It doesn't matter because you can use that excuse. I was live streaming the draft. The rest of you weren't.
Exactly.
So it doesn't matter what position I finished in because I was at a disadvantage to begin with. So
No,
I just want to say that was really impressive, truly.
Oh, thank you so much. That's I appreciate that. Thank you.
I mean, Ottoneu auctions are a lot of fun, but they're also like it takes focus and it takes attention, and it's very hard to do that when you're distracted by trying to talk to an audience. So
yeah, I remember I was brought onto the stream at the start of day 2, and I noticed that all my players that I wanted, that I'd highlighted that morning, that I were my targets, the guys I had to get, all started getting nominated. So I just basically said to the stream, you guys have to stop because I got to focus here.
Right.
I don't know how you did it for 8 hours, Daniel. It was amazing. So thank you.
Especially
again.
when you get to that point of the auction where it's just everybody doesn't have very much money to spend, but you have a list of those guys you really like and you really want to get them for $1 or $2. And then you look away for a second and then you look back and you're like, oh, I didn't even know he was up for bid and you missed out.
I'm sure that happened to those two a ton.
It had to have. It had to have. Yeah.
It was a fun time. It was fun to do. And like I told Mark earlier, like I definitely bid heavy early because I'm like, okay, I got 2 more days of this. I'll just get most of it out of the way.
And that makes sense. And it's something that I talk about sometimes too. Like my strategy when I'm in an auction is very much tailored to how I think and what I'm trying to accomplish. And, you know, if I was in the same situation as you, I would have made the same decision. I would have said, you know what, I can't pay attention to so many auctions. I'm going to just spend it now and then know that I've got 4 hours that I can just chill because I don't have any money left.
Right.
That made a lot of sense. And I think that was the right path. I think it was the wrong path in the sense that it's really hard to do stars and scrubs in a 5x5 league in Ottoneu. It just is. But you really had no way of knowing that before you did it. And you did it for a very good reason because you had to pay attention to streaming everything. So
yeah. Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm sure Dave does as well. I guess, yeah, we're pretty much kind of at the wrapping up point. I suppose, I guess to finish up, I guess maybe our last question, send everyone who's stuck with us for almost 3.5 hours with a little goodies. Just real quick, Justin, do you have any, looking at our free agent list and things like that, did you have any like sleepers or any big things not you know what I mean, but like any good values, anything you saw in there?
Yeah, I mean, I think because there are a lot of players available and there's really, it's across the spectrum as far as positions because inflation is low and negative really. And because there are a lot of good players available, I think really it's no matter what position you're in, as far as your roster, you can find somebody at a position, which is, you know, Chad already said it, like when you get to the 3rd, 4th, 5th year and you're redoing these auctions every year, that's not always going to be the case. You're really going to see that there's only a couple pitchers at the top end and there's only shortstops, especially like at least in the points formats, they're so scarce at auction that if you don't have one before you go into auction, you're really in a bad spot. So the good news is you have a lot of options at pretty much all the positions that you would need to fill. You know, and there's also still a lot of prospects available. You know, because obviously, as we talked about, Wander was cut because of the price, and you know, that would be another situation where if I'm in the auction and I know I don't want to roster him and he's going to go for a lot of money, I'd nominate those prospects that I think are going to get overpaid, and see what happens. Especially because if he goes for another, you know, $12, $13, $14, $15 somewhere in that range, all right, double down and throw Nolan Gorman out there, throw you know, Hunter Green out there, see what happens. But you know, the nice thing is there's definitely a full slate of values and sleepers that are going to be available at this auction. So
yeah, that's really awesome. Lucky for me and for other managers too.
Yeah,
because it like I heard you guys talking on the Autobot podcast, and you were talking about inflation and how so few players there were available. And I just looked at my league and I thought, man, we have a lot of players. If I would need a first baseman, I have a choice between 7 or 8 different guys that I think are going to be great. So I was really hoping that there was going to be deflation, and I think that there will be. But I'm really interested and curious to know, or not curious, but I was very interested to know when you said that it's typical to have deflation in a second year league.
Yeah, and I think for a variety of reasons, I think a lot of first year leagues are in a situation like you guys were in, where it's a lot of newcomers to Ottoneu. So
Yeah.
sometimes they're keeping more players than they should just because they don't have a good sense of the values yet. I think it's also a situation like with this short season, like we don't have a lot of information since the last time we drafted. I mean, you guys happened to draft before everything shut down with the pandemic and before the season got moved back, but there are a lot of Ottoneu leagues that didn't draft until June. And like, it's been not 7 months since that point. Like, I feel like a lot of decisions that Ottoneu managers made this offseason at the keeper deadline, they're thinking, well, I rostered this guy last year for $34. He only went up $2. 36 isn't that much more than 34, so I'll just keep him again. I thought he was worth 34 last year. I'm basically throwing out 2020 as if pretend it didn't happen, which is what we'd all like to do. And then they say, okay, well, I'll keep him at 36 because I just had him for 34, so it's not that big of a difference. And I think that's why across the board in Ottoneu, at least according to the surplus calculator, there's just a lot of negative inflation, and even in older leagues. It's just very bizarre. And I think what it's going to do is it's going to really be a reset for even those older leagues, that they're almost going to function like a first year league all over again. And we're going to see a lot of surplus generated going into next year because prices are going to be depressed at auction. It's going to sort of have a bounce back effect where next year we're probably going to see that there's a lot more surplus available in the league. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of metagaming with Ottoneu sometimes, as far as, trying to, well, am I cutting a guy because of where I think inflation is going to be? And some of that stuff is really tricky. I mean, we talk about it on the podcast, and I may act like I know what I'm talking about, but sometimes I don't. I'm guessing just like everybody else, right?
Yeah.
And this surprised me that I knew there probably was going to be less inflation this year and less surplus available because of the weird year, but it really surprised me how low everything was. So it's going to be interesting to see these auctions actually take place and see, Chad has mentioned it a lot. Like, he really thinks that like Garrett Cole is not going to come at a discount. He's probably going to be $45 to $50 at this auction. I mean, I don't know. It'd be very interesting to see what these top tier values are going to end up like in this auction and then all the other auctions. I think he's generally right that those top values aren't really going to come at a discount, but then you're going to see a lot of values in the middle. And that's a good thing in a 5x5 league because you can really live in the middle.
Yeah, I was thinking that's really interesting too, because if you enact his idea of having flexibility on position and how much money you're going to spend, then you can kind of get away from that $40 or $50 pitcher that you were looking for, and just put that $40 into something else, into another position. So, tying those two together is important.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think it's important to the other thing that we talk about sometimes is not getting attached to a certain name. And he kind of alluded to it too, is like, think about it in terms of like an asset class, right? Like, I want to get a number 2 outfielder or a number 3 starting pitcher, but that could be 6 names. And then you just find the name in that range that you think comes at the best discount, and that's who you get, rather than saying, I have to leave this auction with Christian Yelich, no matter the cost. I mean, you can do that. Go ahead. I'm not stopping you. No one's going to stop you from doing that. But you're leaving money and value on the table if you focus so much on, I just need this particular player, and he's the key to unlocking my season. I think sometimes that laser focus isn't always a good idea. So
that makes a ton of sense. That's just so much fountain of good advice. I could do this for hours.
I could too.
We go for another 2 hours, please.
I just want to real quick. I just want to say there's a few things that we just did and that are on the horizon. We recorded Thursday. We did our first base. No, I'm sorry. We did our catcher preview. We recorded on Friday. We did our first base preview. That's going to be up next week on Monday for the Ottonewbs podcast. Obviously, we're talking with you guys tonight. The 10th anniversary, we're going to do a special live show on Monday night that we're going to stream on Twitch on my channel. And I think we're going to have Fangraphs rehost that as well. So that's just going to be sort of a celebration of the history of Ottoneu, telling the stories about how it was started, special guests. And Niv has a couple announcements that I know he's really excited about. So you guys can tune in, everybody that's listening to this and everybody that's plays Ottoneu. It's going to be, I think, a fun thing to watch and to get some information and hear some fun stories, because the whole thing is kind of crazy that Niv and a college buddy, then they just sort of said, you know what, we don't like tracking this stuff, and we have a spreadsheet to do it all because Yahoo isn't enough for us. And Niv is like, well, I'm just going to build it, right? I'm just going to build it.
Wild. So cool.
And we joke sometimes that he'll get comments from people talking about, his dev team. It's like, no, it's a one-man operation. It's just Niv. He does it all. It's just him. So, and I have to say, and I'm sucking up a little bit, but it's true. He's so engaged with the community. He's so responsive to, he talked about it, right? Arbitration was a request that the community made. He's very responsive to that. And it's impressive to me. Like, that's one of the things that I think really attached me to playing the game was the people that I play with are great, made a lot of connections, a lot of friendships. It's a really great community, but also just him, Niv, who runs it, that he can respond. And he's added things for me to make the surplus calculator run better. Because he said, what can I do to make it easier on the back end? And he's provided me different links and things that I can build in. And because it's a collaborative process, and it's really great that he does that, because it's something that I think the community at large doesn't really notice enough, that it's something that we all take for granted, that he's always there. He's in the Ottoneu community. He's on the Slack group. He's accessible and responsive. And that's a great thing, because, when you play in a lot of other fantasy sites, you don't know who's running it. You don't know that person, and he's not present and responsive. When you have a question, you email him and he gets back to you right away. And he's, especially during auction season, right? Like, sometimes little things go wrong, and he's available, and he'll get back to you and say, oh, something screwy happened in my auction, and he'll help you out right away. So you can shoot an email to help@ottoneu.com, and you're reaching Niv. He doesn't have a customer support team. It's Niv. That's who's responding to you.
That's awesome.
When I sent him an email about doing an article for Pitcher List about evaluating arbitration, and he gave me all the data.
Yep.
He just gave it to me, and I said, can I share this? He said, yeah, go ahead. Share it if you want. Yep. So he was responsive. Quick question, Justin, what time is that stream?
I think we're planning on starting at 6:30 Eastern Monday night. 6:30 Eastern. Okay. It'll be I just changed the name on my Twitch account, but it's twitch.tv/thevibot, VIBBOT. And like I said, I think Fangraphs is planning on rehosting that stream as well. So yeah, it'll be fun. It's me, Niv, and Chad, and then I think he's gonna have somebody else, one of his other college buddies that was instrumental at the beginning of the Ottoneu plan. And like I said, he's got some announcements that I think the community that plays Ottoneu are going to be excited to hear. So
cool. That's awesome. I'm looking very forward to it. Definitely will be tuning in. Just before we sign off for in general, Justin, for the rest of the interwebs, where else can you be reached or anything?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Justin Vibber, and I'm in the Slack group all the time. So anybody that's not in that community, you can go to community.ottoneu.com, and there's a thread in there to get added to the Slack group if you want to get added in there. And I'm in there a lot. And, as Niv said, there's a lot of good chatter in there about Ottoneu and about baseball in general. And there's, just like your Discord, right? There's like a food and travel channel, and, because we're all Ottoneu players and we're all baseball fans, but we're talking about other stuff sometimes too. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
And then, that's fantastic. And then the podcast is Autobots, correct?
Yep. It's Autobot podcast. It's, again, there's a community. If you go to the community forums there, you can do a search for Autobot podcast, and it'll have a thread that I started that includes like the RSS links and the links to it's on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all the rest. So you can either search for it on those individual places or just go to that community post and find all those relevant links. So, yeah. We are going strong, and last year we had Eno Saris on for a starting pitcher episode, and I do believe he's going to join us again this year for our starting pitcher position episode. So that's a blast to be able to have somebody like Eno on. So
yeah, it's one of my top listens. Every time I listen to a lot of pods, and every time it's on in my feed, I listen to that one first. I thought it was absolutely hilarious when you said the catcher is a wasteland and talked for 75 minutes. But then to complain about it, why are you complaining? We want more. Give me more.
I don't know. I mean, it's the running joke that we get really wordy and lengthy podcasts.
No,
And
it's all good stuff. I learned a ton. It was great. So
good. Well, it's good to hear.
I want like 75 minutes minimum, 2 hours minimum. Like let's get the longer the better.
We definitely need to have both of you guys on too, especially maybe we'll do, you guys want to do a recap on the pitcher list side, but we'll have you on to talk about your draft experience as well in a second year draft on the Ottonewbs pod for sure. So
we would love that. That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
And hopefully there will be more green beside my name at that point.
I'm not very good with the aesthetics. I had some help in how to make this look a little prettier because the first version was very, very sparse, but I tried to make it a little more appealing visually. So
no, it looks great.
It makes it so easy to find what you're looking for, and makes things stand out. It's great.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for thinking of me and having me come on. And I know Niv was really excited when you guys started this league, and it was sort of a surprise to him that you were doing it and that you were going to be writing about it. And he likes to hook you guys up sometimes when somebody wants to take advantage of doing that for anybody that wants to write about it. So
yeah, we love supporting it. So it's, like I said, it's been a ton of fun, and we love trying to get the word out and get more people to do it too. So yeah,
it's a great game, and it's a great community, and it's a great person who runs that runs the whole platform. So it's great all around.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
So again, it's Justin Viver with Ottoneu and the Ottonewbs podcast. Mark, do you have anywhere anyone can reach you?
I don't use Twitter very often. I don't really like it very much, to be honest, but I am on it. It's Mark McElroy BB. I'm also on Pitcher List with articles every now and then. I'll be doing the newsletter quite a lot this season. You can reach me on at any time if you have any interest in anything to ask or anything at all. It's fine.
And I've seen already the prototypes Mark's put out for what we might be getting from the newsletter this year. So it's looking great. It's going to be really cool. Subscribe to it because you get everything we do every day. You get everything coming out. It's just a great way to kind of get your fantasy day started. So definitely check out Mark's newsletter. I'm Daniel Port. You can find me on Twitter at Daniel J. Port. There's a good mix of baseball, food photos of things I cook and things I build in my house. So, all kinds of stuff going on. So follow me there. And you can also find me. I run the Discord. So come join the Discord. PL Plus is really fun. It's a good time to come chat about some baseball and do a ton of other things. We got a lot of things in store. We got 6.0 coming out next Tuesday. So yeah, if you need anything or have any questions, reach out to me. And otherwise, hopefully we'll see you on the Discord or around the baseball world. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night, and we'll probably see you again around when we have our draft in March.
Yes. Bye. Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thank you.